Chapter 3957. When Yuan took out his phone and dialed Sumo's number. Sumo took a long time to answer. When Yuan wanted to ridicule her, but Sumo's voice was so hoarse that she couldn't help but be a little stunned. Sumo, what's wrong with you? Sumo rubbed her nose. Nothing, I just caught a cold. When Yuan nodded, and then remembered something. By the way, did you give the recording to Yumubai? Sumo smiled and said bitterly, didn't it increase our feelings? You were tortured, weren't you? Wen Yuan wanted to say something, but he felt that Sumo was strange, so he only said that they would have coffee next time. But when he hung up the phone, he remembered that Yumubai said that Kong Qiao was also there. She should ask Sumo if she had seen him later. Just when she was about to call him, Yumubai came in. He was already neatly dressed and walking towards her. When Yuan admitted that she used to be his dog for appearances, and now, it seemed that she still was. Yumubai squatted down and looked at her puppy-like expression. He smiled and said, are you going to send Xiangnan and Yihui with me, or are you going to stay at home and bring me lunch? I want to sleep for a while more. My head is still a little dizzy. She went to hug him, and he let her hug him. After a while, he deliberately frowned. You've made me wet. Should I take a bath too? She immediately stopped herself and said no.
He was really hot at any time.
Yumubai smiled and stopped teasing her. He said in a hoarse voice, then I'll go first. He scratched her face again. If I still do this to you at night, you'll be good. She remembered how she was tortured by him from behind, and her face was extremely red. She pulled his hand. Mubai, there's something I want to tell you. He grunted and reached his hand into the bathtub. He grasped it in a few strokes and played with it from time to time. She had a favor to ask of him, so even if he went too far, she still let him be. She said softly, Teacher is not in good health. I want to see her.
He was surprised.
Kong Qiao's mother? Then he added, didn't you just see her? She looked at him and moved closer to his hand to please him. She hung her hands around his neck. Mubai, teacher is sick. I should go and see her. His hands were not idle. He pondered for a while and said, I'll go with you. When? She was shocked and frowned. Isn't that bad? What's not good about it? He squeezed hard, and Wen Yuan immediately cried out, but she did not dare to struggle and obediently let him touch her until he pleased her. Perhaps because of her good attitude, Yumubai didn't reject her immediately. Tomorrow morning.
I'll ask Secretary he to spare some time.
I can't do it today. I have to discuss a collaboration with CEO Qin of King Entertainment. Wen Yuan hummed. Is it Qin Mo? He finally retracted his hand and lowered his gaze to look at his fingers. Wen Yuan bit his lower lip and felt very embarrassed. He leaned over to kiss her and wrote a few words on her back. She was startled. His voice was low and pleasant. You still say you don't like it, huh? She let him do whatever he wanted and continued to act coquettishly in his arms. Mubai, can you do it? I'll go with you tomorrow morning. He did not allow her to refuse and kissed her. Wen Yuan did not say anything. She was a little unhappy, but since he was willing to go with her, it was fine. It was good to let teachers see him. Chapter 3958. Yumubai raised his hand to look at the time and smiled. He gently pressed his finger on her lips, hinting that Wen Yuan's face turned red. I'm leaving. I'll go to the company at noon, okay? He finally got up and left. Wen Yuan watched his back as he slid into the bathtub again. She felt ashamed when she thought about how he had treated her just now. When did she become so accommodating? Wen Yuan soaked for a while more and got up. She put on a bathrobe and thought about it before calling Sumo. Sumo was busy. She called a few more times but couldn't get through, so she could only give up. When she went to the company at noon, she specially asked Secretary He. Secretary He asked about it and said that Manager Su had a cold and was on leave. When Secretary He mentioned this, he smiled. This isn't Manager Su's style. Manager Su used to be called Su Sanfight. He didn't treat colds as illnesses and drank alcohol as usual. I guess his health isn't as good as before. When Yuan thanked him and came back from Secretary He's place. Yimubai had already finished his work and was sitting on the sofa waiting for Wen Yuan to eat. When she came back, she gave him a cold shoulder. He couldn't help but laugh. "What's wrong now?" he said lazily. "Did you not feel comfortable serving me in the morning?" Wen Yuan sat beside him and began to work on the lunchbox. She glanced at him. "I was the one who served you." Yimubai smiled and then hooked her chin. "Isn't it good that you didn't even have breakfast?" He was really vulgar. Wen Yuan looked away. "Let's eat." He smiled and ate with her. After a while, Wen Yuan still asked him, "Suemo, can you let her drink less in the future?" "You're blaming me?" He smiled lazily and then reached out to grab Wen Yuan. "I remember that Mrs. Yi isn't that kind, nor is she overflowing with love." Wen Yuan looked at him. "It's not easy for Suemo, yes. So you have to do what you can," Yimubai said coldly. "If she continues like this, she will kill herself one day." Wen Yuan looked at him. What's wrong with her? He didn't want to tell her. He didn't want her to come into contact with those things. In his heart, Wen Yuanhe should live in a greenhouse forever. She only needed to stay by his side gracefully and beautifully. Yimubai smiled. "It's nothing. She just likes to help others. She's a bit stupid." He paused for a moment. Su Mo paid for Zhang Meng's breach of contract. Wen Yuan bit his lip. "Can't you just not accept her? She doesn't have to work so hard. He will be defeated sooner or later." He pinched her face and said in a low and husky voice, "Wen Yuan, personal relationships are personal relationships, but you can't have them at work. Do you understand?" She just looked at him and said nothing. Angry again? Pinching her cheeks, he thought for a moment and said, "She needs money, so she transferred 1% and Starlight's shares to me. 200 million, so she doesn't need to drink too much for now." Wen Yuan pursed his lips. "But there's always a time to spend money." He patted her. "That's 200 million, Mrs. Yi." She looked at him eagerly. "Is 200 million a lot?" He looked at her with a strange expression. After a while, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. When he let go of her, he hummed. "You did it on purpose, didn't you?" Wen Yuan laughed. He hummed and let go of her and began to eat. Wen Yuan lay in his arms and said in a low voice, "Are you angry?" Chapter 39:59. He looked at her and took her down. "Be good and eat." She refused to hug him from behind. She buried her face in his back and nibbled on his muscles through the fabric of his shirt. Yimubai paused and then looked at her. "Wen Yuan, it's okay if you don't want to eat." She immediately stopped making a fuss and obediently ate with him. Yimubai glanced at her and suddenly said, "I don't want to be like Suemo, Wen Yuan. I'd rather be selfish." He sighed. "That will be hard." Wen Yuan looked at him. "Can't she change?" "She can't. I've told her many times not to worry about things that she can't control, but she's still so kind. But there's a way." He looked at her. Wen Yuan nodded. "What is it?" "Find her a rich long-term meal ticket," he said softly. She let out an awe and looked at him. He smiled and then said meaningfully, "Kong Qiao is not bad. Doesn't Suemo like him? Don't you want to play with him?" Wen Yuan looked at him in disbelief. "Didn't you forbid me to contact Kong Qiao? That was in the past. Now it's different." Yimubai stroked her long hair and thought. Kong Qiao is in his 30s. Didn't Wen Yuan say that teacher has been anxious about his marriage? Suemo is not bad. You just said that she's a trap. Wen Yuan looked at him. He smiled. Did I say that?" "That's right." Wen Yuan thought about it carefully. "I'll try." Yimubai looked at her and sighed in his heart. Actually, Wen Yuan was really simple. She was a single-celled creature. All her schemes were probably used to chase after him. Wen Yuan had already started to plan in her heart. She was absent-minded. Yimubai was secretly amused. Wen Yuan was really a treasure girl. It was probably because she hadn't gone out to work in the past few years. Early the next morning, Yimubai asked the chauffeur to send the two kids to school. He brought Wen Yuan to buy some fruits and flowers. They wanted to buy lilies, but Wen Yuan said that the teacher had rhinitis, so carnations were fine. He let her choose, and after paying, he took her to the hospital. Kong Qiao followed his mother's surname. Although Teacher Kong was staying in the hospital, he was resting and did not have any major problems. However, it was inconvenient for him to stay alone, so he decided to stay for more than 10 days. Teacher Kong kept saying that Kong Qiao was using up public resources. Kong Qiao poured water for her mother as she sat down. This place is usually empty, so it's not occupied. Not many people stayed in the ward that cost 10,000 yuan a night. Besides, his mother didn't want to stay with him, and she didn't want to hire a nurse to take care of her. He could only come to see her every day. Fortunately, he would be fine after a few days. Teacher Kong sighed. I've always felt uneasy. I've been teaching all my life, and I've always been clean. Now, it's too wasteful. Kong Qiao smiled faintly. Mom, you're thinking too much. Let's see if any of the students you teach are clean. Mother Kang's face turned stern. She's also someone who loves fame and fortune. I've said it before. It's good to be a professor in a music academy, but she insisted on going abroad. As she said that, she sighed. Actually, Wen Yuan is very good. Kong Qiao said bitterly. Mom, why are you mentioning this? Back then, if he hadn't gone abroad, it would have been impossible for him and Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan's family was very prominent, and she had no feelings for him. Chapter 3960. While Kong Qiao and Mrs. Kong were talking, Yimu Bai and Wen Yuan were standing at the door with a nurse. When Kong Qiao saw them, he was stunned. Then the atmosphere became awkward. Yimu Bai was the first to speak. Wen Yuan, please have a chat. Kong Qiao, and I will go outside for a smoke. Although he said that, he still helped Wen Yuan carry the gifts in and greeted Ms. Kong politely. It was Ms. Kang's first time seeing Yimu Bai. She had seen him in movies before. He was more mature and introverted in real life. Ms. Kong sighed in her heart. What kind of family did he come from? Kong Qiao really couldn't compare. Yimu Bai comforted the old man and went out with Kong Qiao. Wen Yuan helped Mrs. Kong to sit down. Miss Kong, how are you feeling? Mrs. Kong smiled and put her hand on the back of her hand. I'm fine. It's just an old problem. Kong Qiao was worried and wanted me to stay in the hospital. It's boring here. Wen Yuan remembered what Kong Qiao had said to her before and tried to persuade her. Miss Kong, Kong Qiao is flying all over the world. You should hire an auntie to take care of him. That way, he will feel more at ease. Miss Kong was silent for a while and said in a low voice, Actually, I'm afraid that with an auntie, Kong Qiao will come back less often.
She paused.
It's not appropriate to say this, but Wen Yuan knows that Kong Qiao has something on his mind. He doesn't really want to come back. He might not want to face it. Ms. Kong sighed. He has made a lot of money these years. They call him a music genius. What genius? His music has lost its soul. It's just techniques. It's very exaggerated. Wen Yuan couldn't say anything. Actually, she had noticed it last time. Ms. Kong changed the topic. Let's not talk about this. Wen Yuan, I heard that you're doing well recently. I'm very happy for you. Wen Yuan pursed his lips.
He's all right.
Ms. Kong smiled. He's very handsome. As Yimu Bai's pride dog, Wen Yuan smiled a little foolishly. At this moment, another wave of students came to visit Teacher Kong. They were all doing quite well. Some were running private training classes, some were going abroad, and some were slightly famous in the music industry. The worst one seemed to be Wen Yuan. She had achieved nothing and stayed at home. Moreover, she had divorced a famous person. Very few students knew that she had married Yimu Bai, the CEO of Stars Entertainment. Wen Yuan was besieged. It was a 10-year class reunion. Wen Yuan instinctively wanted to refuse because she didn't know if Yimu Bai wanted her to participate, so she said she might not be free. A female classmate looked at Wen Yuan and cleared her throat. Wen Yuan's bag isn't bad. It's a Hermes Platinum bag, right? But I heard that there are some imitations these days that are really good. What's the source? Can you tell us? Of course, we won't carry fake ones. But it's inevitable that our relatives will like it. It's good to give one to them to satisfy their vanity. Wen Yuan looked at Teacher Kong. Teacher Kong was also very helpless. Just as she was about to say something, Wen Yuan told her not to say it.
She didn't care about this.
The female classmate continued to speak harshly. By the way, we're all bringing family members to this gathering. Wen Yuan, has he remarried in the past few years? It's understandable that he found a wife so well the first time around. If he hasn't, he can still be single. I'm married, Wen Yuan said calmly and smiled. Chapter 3961. The female classmate was surprised. You're married? We've never heard of it. By the way, where are you working now? The man you found isn't good enough, right? You've put aside your professional knowledge for so many years. It must be hard and poor for you to do something else. Wen Yuan smiled. It's all right. She had been indifferent the whole time, and the women who took turns to talk were pretty boring. Thus, she put on a fake smile and put on a plump face. I'll definitely participate when the time comes. If life is too difficult, there's still us classmates. We can all take care of each other. Wen Yuan still smiled faintly and watched those girls leave. After they left, Teacher Kong sighed. They are still thinking about the time when you were in the limelight in school. The children who used to be so simple and straightforward had now become like this. It was really heartbreaking. Teacher Kong looked at Wen Yuan. Don't go if you don't want to. Don't force yourself. Wen Yuan smiled. Teacher, I'm fine. I'm fine. If I go, I'll go. Otherwise, I'll seem too petty. Teacher Kong was annoyed and amused at the same time. He also felt sorry for her. You're too easy to talk to. You've been bullied to this extent. Why don't you defend yourself? Because it's not someone I care about. Wen Yuan smiled faintly and supported Mrs. Kong. Let me give you a massage. Your waist will hurt again if you keep sitting. Mrs. Kong didn't refuse. She truly loved Wen Yuan as her own daughter. So, she wouldn't refuse Wen Yuan's kindness. Besides, only Wen Yuan looked at her sincerely. The two of them chatted. Kong Qiao and Yi Mubai were smoking in the corridor. Kong Qiao's gaze was especially deep. After a long time he whispered, Yi Mubai, you win. He paused for a moment and then said, Actually, I can never be with her. From the day I went abroad, or the day I was born, I was destined to never be with Wen Yuan. Yi Mubai is a truly beautiful person. She hasn't seen any darkness. Treat her well. Yi Mubai smiled faintly. Kong Qiao, do you know what you're like? Kong Qiao stared at him. Yi Mubai's voice was low. It's like having the appearance of an angel and the heart of a devil. Kong Qiao was stunned. You're really thorough. Then why did you give Su Mo a chance to get close to me? Don't say it was a coincidence.
I didn't choose the place that day.
It was an impromptu decision. Because Su Mo is the opposite of you. She has the toughest appearance and the softest heart. Kong Qiao, let her save you. Otherwise, you won't be clean for the rest of your life. Yi Mubai said. Concho, on the other hand, was still standing on the armrest, quietly smoking. Kong Qiao. He smiled.
He laughed. He. That he.
He, she, he. Who, he.
He. And he. He.
Him.
He. She. He.
Kong?
He.
The he.
He.
He put out his cigarette and was about to turn around and leave when he saw a thin figure wearing a mask. If he was not mistaken, that person was Su Mo. Kong Qiao pursed his lips. When he came back to himself, he had already gone downstairs. He grabbed her hand before she left. Why did you come to the hospital? He had a bad idea. He hooked the medical file bag in her hand and opened it. Then his face turned pale. She was checked for HIV in the hospital. Chapter 3962. Kong Qiao's face darkened. Su Mo, I don't have AIDS. Su Mo snatched the thing from his hand and said in a nasal voice, Who knows? Mr. Kong, you're such a mess. Kong Qiao's face darkened even more. Su Mo, this isn't your first time either. It's better than you, and I'm not selling it. Facing him, She was completely different from before. She was especially direct and rude, just like how she usually was. She had a clear distinction between love and hate. Clearly, when she saw Kong Qiao in the past, she would deliberately pretend to be like this, but there was no need to do so now. He was a scum. Kong Qiao sneered. Yes, Manager Su won't sell it. Manager Su will only be infatuated with the men she likes. He pulled her to his side, almost sticking to his chest. It was very intimate, but only she knew how rude and barbaric he was at this moment. He was a bastard. Su Emo struggled with all her might, but to no avail. Instead, she was dragged into his arms. Didn't you suspect that I have HIV? Why weren't you afraid when you seduced me in bed with me? Huh? He was terrifyingly domineering. Su Emo saw a trace of malice in his eyes, and she was stunned. At that moment, she seemed to have seen the real Kong Qiao. Su Emo slowly gave up struggling. She looked at him, her pupils dilated, and murmured, "You hate yourself like this, don't you?" Kong Qiao's face darkened. He remembered what Yi Mubai had said, that Su Emo was suitable to save him. What was there to save? In this kind of Vanity Fair, he was in his element. He was not a man who would casually go to bed with others. There were many women who were holding a lot of money and kneeling down to lick his boots. He was not interested in them. What he pursued was a stable cooperative relationship. If necessary, he would consider having a one-night stand with the other party. This was Kong Qiao. Ordinary people had to go through this path to survive in the circle, but he did not need to do so. He had long been successful, and now there were a lot of people begging him to play a song. Even if it was a mess, it would still be regarded as a classic. Kong Qiao felt like he was living a rotten life, so he yearned for Wen Yuan's purity. Her piano playing was beautiful, just like in the past. At this moment, his feelings were exposed, and he was embarrassed into anger. And this list was simply a humiliation to him. He folded Su Emo in his arms and said in a cold and hard voice, "Miss Su, remember this in the future. Before you have sex with a man, you must first ask him to submit an HIV report to you. The last one must be within half a year." He was full of mockery, and then threw her away. Su Emo almost fell to the ground. She glared at him with red eyes and said hoarsely, "Kong Qiao, you can't lie to yourself. You're just a walking corpse. I'm also warning you, don't even think about hitting Wen Yuan's principles. A whore like you isn't worthy. Male whore." Kong Qiao wanted to strangle the woman in front of her, but Su Emo did not back down. Her eyes were burning with flames. That flame was called, "Male whore, go to hell." Kong Qiao glared at her. "We'll never meet again. Do you think I want to see you?" Her voice was cold, but it was choked with a bit of anger. After that, Su Emo ran away. Kong Qiao looked at her back and pinched her fingers. Damn it, male whore. By the time he returned to the ward, Wen Yuan and Yi Mubai had already left. At this moment, Yi Mubai had just started the car, and Wen Yuan saw that the car beside him seemed to be Sumo's car. Chapter 3963. Yi Mubai followed Wen Yuan's gaze and looked over. It was Su Emo. She was sitting there rubbing her nose and dressed like a celebrity to prevent people from secretly taking pictures. He opened the car door for Wen Yuan and she immediately got out. Yi Mubai wasn't a person who liked to join in the fun, but he also got out. When Su Emo saw them, she was a little confused. After a long time, she squeezed out a sentence. "C.O. Yi, why are you in the hospital?" "I'm here to see Kong Qiao's mother." Wen Yuan looked at her red nose. "Is your cold serious? I heard from Secretary He that you asked for leave." At this time, Wen Yuan was looking at a report. She was close to Su Emo, so she didn't think much about it and directly took it to read. As she opened it, she said, "Hospital reports are so high-end now." As soon as she opened it, she saw the 3 letters HIV. No matter how ignorant Wen Yuan was, she knew what it was. Her eyes slowly turned to Yi Mubai and then to Su Emo. Su Emo felt uncomfortable, but she was afraid that they would misunderstand, so she had to tell the truth. "It's like this. One night, I accidentally got drunk and had sex with a man. Of course, I have to be careful with a man I don't know. It's better to be prepared. As soon as she finished speaking, Wen Yuan smashed the report on her head. How dare you have a one-night stand? Yi Mubai picked it up from the side. He thought that Su Mo didn't have any dinner parties recently. If there was a chance for a one-night stand after getting drunk, it should be Kong Qiao. Why did Kong Qiao show her teeth at Su Mo? Otherwise, why would Su Mo check this? He found it funny and returned the report to Su Mo. Then, he pulled Mrs. Yi back and coaxed, Su Mo is an adult. It's not a big deal to have a private life. You've been single for so long. Do you have a private life too? Wen Yuan asked directly. Yi Mubai touched his nose. You guys talk. His behavior was like a reality. He did. Wen Yuan was angry, but he couldn't just ignore Su Mo. First, he fiercely taught Su Mo a lesson, but it wasn't enough. After that, he refused to leave. Su Mo glanced at Yi Mubai for help, but Wen Yuan got angry again. What's the use of looking at him? I'll check him later. Su Mo couldn't help but laugh. Wen Yuan wanted to fight with her, but in the end, he was dragged away by Yi Mubai.
All right.
Su Mo is already an adult. She's already 30 years old. It's fine if she doesn't say a word after being pointed at and scolded by you like a primary school student. She has a guilty conscience. Wen Yuan sat in the car and even threatened Su Mo, who was in the car next to him. The way he bared his fangs and brandished his claws made Su Mo immediately drive the car away. Wen Yuan was furious. Look at her. Why doesn't she find a man to date? Why does she have to have a one-sided relationship? No, I have to introduce Kong Qiao to her. Yi Mubai reached out and stroked his smooth chin. You don't mind? What if Kong Qiao is as pure as ice and pure as jade? Won't she feel that he's at a disadvantage? Wen Yuan looked at him and said very slowly, It can't be. Kong Qiao is more than 30 years old. It's impossible for him to be like that. Yi Mubai found it funny, but in the end, he didn't say anything. He directly started the car, and Wen Yuan's fiery eyes fell on his face. After a long time, he said fiercely, Yi Mubai, don't you want to explain your dark history? Of course, he wouldn't admit it. He pretended to be dead. What dark history? Chapter 3964. Wen Yuan knew nothing about it. MP2 Wen Yuan was quite angry. He sat up straight and ignored him, refusing to go to the company with him. In the end, he coaxed and pestered her to go to the company. Yi Mubai's dark history was actually quite simple and crude. It happened during the period when he lost his memory. There were some consensual affairs, but smart men would never mention it again, let alone admit it. So no matter how angry Wen Yuan was, he always had a way to coax her. Anyway, he would not admit it. Wen Yuan was angry and ignored him during the lunch break, locking him outside the lounge. She called Bai Shueli and told her about Yi Mubai's dark history. How could Bai Shueli know about it? Only Yi Mubai himself knew about it, but normal men wouldn't say it. Wen Yuan, don't think about the past anymore. Bai Shueli lay on the bed and shook her feet. The important thing is the future, the future. Wen Yuan sighed deeply. I'm angry just thinking about it. Give him the cold shoulder for a few days. Bai Shueli said, he must be very uncomfortable. He's used to eating fish and meat every day. If you let him not have grass to eat every day, he'll be very uncomfortable. Wen Yuan. She wasn't fat at all. How was she eating fish and meat? Anyway, she felt much better after hanging up the phone. She lay down for a while and then went out to tell Yi Mubai that she was going shopping. He was talking to secretary. He frowned. I'll go with you after I'm done with work. She reached out to him. I don't have money. He looked at her and finally took out a card from his wallet and put it in her palm. Ask the driver to send you, and he coughed lightly. Buy me some shirts and ties. Wen Yuan snorted. People with dark history don't have the right to buy things. Yi Mubai didn't care that secretary he was there. He sneered. Mrs. Yi, you don't just have a dark history. You have a marriage history. Yi Mubai. Wen Yuan was furious. She swore to destroy his card, so she called Bai Shueli along. When the two women saw each other, They started to complain about their husbands. Wen Yuan didn't think there was anything to complain about Yi Mulin, but she thought of something. She hesitated for a long time before asking, "Did Mulin really abuse your family in the past?" Bai Shueli's face fell. She held her chin and sighed. "It's not that serious. He's just a pervert who likes to use violence." She complained in a soft voice, "You don't even know how inexperienced he is. Nor is he gentle. He just does whatever he wants. Anyway, I hated him to death when we first got married." Wen Yuan received an incredible piece of information, which was that Yi Mulin was still a virgin on his wedding night. Thinking about it, a serious elite, in order to hide his virginity, he became very rough. And so, Wen Yuan was cured, and he was very satisfied. She and Bai Shueli went shopping together and spent a few million yuan in one afternoon. Yi Mubai received messages from the bank from time to time. When he saw the amount spent in a men's clothing store, he smiled happily. When he got off work, he called Wen Yuan. "Mrs. Yi, do you need Mr. Yi to pick you up?" Wen Yuan snorted. "No, I have a driver." He stretched out his hand to pull his tie. "Well, see you later." He lowered his voice. "Don't eat outside, do you hear me?" Her answer was to hang up. He looked at his phone and said to himself, "It seems that I spoiled her." "Secretary," he held back his laughter. "But is Mrs. Yi cute like this?"
Cute?
Yi Mubai said with a smile. He took his coat and car keys and walked out.
That's all for today.
"Secretary," tomorrow, I won't come in the morning." End of this chapter. Chapter 3965. Yi Mubai drove to the villa. Xiangnan and Yi Hui had already gone back. Wen Yuan came back 10 minutes later. The trunk was full of things. They were all the trophies she had bought today. Yi Mubai helped her pack up. Some of them were Xiangnan and Yi Hui's. He asked Xiangnan to help his sister move them back to the room and slowly dismantle them. He moved their own things back to the bedroom. There were so many things, so he moved them all at once. Wen Yuan followed him and watched him take out a box and open it. It was a pair of crystal cufflinks. He took it off and buckled it on his sleeve. "It's not bad." He looked at the shirt and tie again. Then he smiled and pulled Wen Yuan onto his lap. His voice was a little hoarse. "I like it when you take care of these for me." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. She just leaned on his shoulder. He knew that she still cared about what had happened before. Although he didn't say it, she could guess his thin lips were close to her ear. "I won't betray our marriage, okay?"
Wen Yuan didn't say anything.
In fact, she also knew that she couldn't afford to be calculative. This matter passed just like that. She didn't mention it again, nor did she throw a tantrum. She ate calmly and took care of the children. Xiangnan and Yi Hui were very happy because there were many gifts that they had wanted but hadn't bought. The two children were very happy, so Wen Yuan let them play by themselves. She went back to the master bedroom. Yi Mubai had already taken a shower. He was wearing a bathrobe and leaning against the headboard. The bedside lamp was on, but the main one was not. This was a signal that he wanted to do it. Wen Yuan suddenly felt a little nervous. They had to do it every day, but this kind of hint still made her a little ashamed. When she came in, he looked up. "The two children are still playing?" She nodded. "They're quite happy." Then she took her pajamas to take a shower. When she came back and climbed onto the bed, he put down the magazine and put her in his arms. He didn't lie down, but hugged her from behind. He bit her neck from behind and said in a hoarse voice, "Are you not angry anymore?" She felt a little uncomfortable being bitten by him, but she still endured it. She grabbed her pajamas tightly with one hand and placed the other on his leg. Her body stiffened, and he chuckled. "Can't stand it." Actually, he didn't do much. He just kissed her a few times and she became like this. He wasn't in a hurry and continued to tease her. After a while, he finally reached his hand out. Then, he was somewhat surprised, and his voice was even dripping. "You're not wearing anything underneath?" Wen Yuan turned his head in his arms and kissed his chin. He kissed it lightly and then moved to kiss the corner of his mouth. His voice was intermittent. "Anyway, I'll have to take it off later." He chuckled and kissed and hugged her just like that. He wasn't a man who liked to do things directly. He would always tease her for a long time until her skin was as red as a cooked shrimp and she begged him. Only then would he be willing to give it to her. Today was no exception. After one round, it was already an hour later. He did not enjoy it much. He put on his pajamas and went to check on Xiang Nan and Yi Hui. After making sure that they were asleep, he came back to continue making love to her. Wen Yuan took very good care of herself. He loved her body very much and had a strong interest in it. He did have other women before. It was a ridiculous period of time, but after he married Wen Yuan, he had never thought of having sex with other women. He had no desire to explore other women's bodies at all. He only wanted her. In the end, Wen Yuan still couldn't take it anymore and begged him to end it. Yi Mubai seriously wanted to continue, but he also knew that he had been quite indulgent recently, and Wen Yuan would occasionally be hurt by him. He calmed down and whispered in her ear, "Did I hurt you?" Wen Yuan pressed her face flat against his chest. "No, I'm just a little tired." She and he had a good relationship recently. She didn't want to argue with him for too long because of the past, but she still wanted to talk to him. "Mubai, she propped herself up. "I don't want to go to your company all the time. I'd rather stay at home when I'm free. I can do some housework. If I go all the time, I'll feel like an accessory to you. There's no need to go all the time." He closed his eyes, thought for a moment, and opened them again. "You really don't want to go?" She nodded. "I actually still want to work." Yi Mubai stared at her face and didn't say anything. He just reached out and gently touched her face. "Isn't it good to stay at home?" "Wen Yuan, I don't want you to work so hard. Look at Su Mo. She often vomits because she wants to do one more business. I want to teach." She looked at him. "I used to teach too. Work is very simple and I don't need to go out to drink. Mubai, you can't always lock me up." After she said this, he looked at her with a somewhat deep gaze. Wen Yuan knew that her words had touched him. She bit her lip and looked at him. Her voice became even lower. "Please, okay?" Chapter 3966. She pulled his hand, and when he didn't move, she leaned over and kissed him. His eyes flickered, and his voice was hoarse. "Wen Yuan." She bit her lip, and her lips were as red as blood. Then, she boldly sat on his lap. This was the first time that Wen Yuan took the initiative to please him in order to achieve her goal. Of course, Yi Mubai enjoyed it, but he didn't give in easily. He just said that he would consider it. After that, Wen Yuan didn't get a definite answer, so she directly bit his chest, and her eyes were red. Yi Mubai looked down, and then gently pulled her hair. "If I don't agree, you can bite me like this." "You're so cruel." Wen Yuan bit her lip, and then bit the other side. She even showed an expression that said, "If you don't agree, then come and bite me." Yi Mubai looked at her, pulled her over, and took turns to bite her. His voice was also hoarse. "You're tired of living, aren't you?" Wen Yuan lay in his arms, and her voice was soft. "Who asked you not to let me go out?" She climbed up and sat in his arms again. Then, she coquettishly talked about meeting a few female classmates today. After talking for a while, she looked at him. "Do you think it's because I don't work that people think that I'm carrying a fake bag? That's why they think that I'm living a miserable life." Because of the love affair, Yi Mubai was lazy. He reached out and gently stroked Wen Yuan's delicate neck. "Whether you go to work or not has nothing to do with the bag you're carrying. Teacher Wen, you can't buy the bag you're carrying today even if you work for years." He knew that Wen Yuan's annual salary was only about 200,000 yuan, and she only carried a bag of 500,000 yuan. After Yi Mubai said that, Wen Yuan was naturally angry. She glared at him for a long time. He reached out and touched her chin. He chuckled. "I didn't say anything wrong, Teacher Wen." He called her Teacher Wen because he didn't have good intentions. Wen Yuan hugged his neck and angrily bit his Adam's apple. Yi Mubai's voice trembled. "Wen Yuan." She also felt that he was different. Her face was a little hot, but she still looked at him and said in a low voice, "You're wrong." He chuckled. "What's wrong, Teacher Wen?" Wen Yuan was exasperated.
He was addicted to it.
She hugged him deliberately and raised her head to his lips. Her voice was also low and hoarse, but Mrs. Yi does more than this every night. Even Yi Mu Bai was stunned for a moment. Then he realized the meaning behind her words. He chuckled softly and hugged her waist. When Yuan obediently lay in his arms, after an hour, Yi Mu Bai held his breath and kissed the woman in his arms. He sighed, "When Yuan, you really want to kill me." She put her arms around his neck. "How much is it worth?" He looked at her, then took a checkbook from a nearby drawer and wrote a set of numbers. When Yuan picked it up and looked at it. 50 million? Was she that expensive? Even an A-list actress wouldn't have such a price, right? Yi Mu Bai sneered. "This is the price for a month." When Yuan. The two of them messed around for a long time.
She suddenly thought of something.
"There will be a class reunion in a few days. They said that they will bring a partner. Will you go?" She said while playing with the beard on his chin. In fact, she didn't have much hope. Yi Mu Bai didn't care much about these things between women. Besides, his identity was not suitable. He lowered his head and looked at her. "Do you want me to go?" Chapter 3967. She thought about it carefully and said, "A little bit, I'm not convinced." Then she put her arms around his neck and said, "Yi Mu Bai, I wasn't such a vain person before." She looked at his eyes and said, "It must be because I married you that I became like this." Yi Mu Bai smiled and agreed readily after a while. "I'll go. Take it as a repayment for Mr. Wen's dedication just now." She glared at him. He smiled and kissed her. "Okay, let's go to sleep, unless you want to do it again." When Yuan was already very satisfied. She was tired from moving her fingers. How could she still think about it? So she lay on his shoulder. "I'm so tired." He lay down with her in his arms. He was also very satisfied. It had nothing to do with Yuan, but because she was so soft in his arms. Sometimes he could really see little stars in her eyes. Yi Mu Bai's heart was indescribably satisfied. Before falling asleep, he put his ear against her ear and said in a low and hoarse voice, "About teaching, let me think about it, En?" When Yuan was already very happy that he could say that. She turned around and hugged him, throwing herself into his arms. Her voice was as soft as a lamb's. "Mu Bai, you're so good. If I don't agree, it won't be good, right?"
He laughed.
She murmured a few words. He couldn't hear it clearly, but he felt that she was fluffy and indescribably cute. The next day, when Yuan slept late, when he woke up, he had already got up and put on his tie. Seeing that she was awake, he bent over and kissed her. His voice was even lower. "I'm going to work. Rest at home today. Don't run around." When Yuan put his arms around his neck and helped him fix his tie. "I want to see Suemo," he thought for a while. "Okay, but don't catch a cold." She nodded. He kissed her for a while, kissing and rubbing her, making Wen Yuan confused. Then he left. She glared at him, and him there. Yi Mu Bai smiled and picked up his coat to cover his embarrassment. He was running out of time. Otherwise, he wouldn't have let her go so easily. After he left, when Yuan couldn't sleep, he stretched and then looked at the sun outside.
It was a beautiful day.
It was so peaceful and beautiful that it was a little sinful. When Yuan stretched again and decided to get up an hour later, she drove out. Before she left, she asked Su and Mo to go to her apartment. It was not Wen Yuan's first time going there, so he was familiar with the route. Not only did he go there, but he also bought a few big bags of fruits, vegetables, and cold seafood and meat from the supermarket. Wen Yuan had not done these things in the past few years, and he only did it occasionally for Su Mo. Su Mo was a very casual person. Her home was as clean and simple as a snow cave. Wen Yuan felt that she was wearing all the glamour, so he didn't approve of it. Su Mo, on the other hand, felt that she could move at any time, so there was no need to be so warm. In fact, Wen Yuan knew why. Su Mo no longer had any relatives, and she did not have a sense of belonging to this city. She felt like she could leave at any time, so she did not put in any effort. When she knocked on the door and brought the things in, Su Mo was still in his pajamas. He brushed his teeth, and his voice was particularly muffled. If CEO Yi knew that you were doing hard labor here, he would definitely be furious. She brushed her teeth and said obscene words. Poor CEO Yi. You can't even wash your hands and make ji soup. 1 yuan knocked her. I'll help you make breakfast. Hurry up and tidy yourself up. Suemo smiled meaningfully. While brushing his teeth, he said in a muffled voice, I like to come from behind. Chapter 3968. Suemo smiled meaningfully. As he swiped his phone, he mumbled, some people seem to like to attack from behind. 1 yuan was speechless. Although she was angry, she still made breakfast for Suemo. Suemo smiled and said, 1 yuan, if I were a man, I would marry you. You are such a good wife. I won't let you go out to work. 1 yuan stuffed a piece of bread into her mouth and sneered, if you were a man, I wouldn't marry you if you were having a one-night stand every day. Suemo swallowed hard and squeezed out a smile. I'm drunk. Who's the adulterer? 1 yuan asked. Suemo felt a little uncomfortable. 1 yuan, why are you asking this? Let him take responsibility, 1 yuan said confidently. Suemo paused for a moment and then looked at 1 yuan and said, what if it's an adulterer? Isn't that pushing me into the fire pit? 1 yuan stared at her, his eyes burning. How do you know it's an adulterer? Suemo bit her fork and smiled meaningfully. He's experienced. He's definitely an old hand. If there's no woman, it won't be so comfortable. You enjoy it? 1 yuan sneered. Enjoying going to the hospital to check for HIV? It's an accident. I'm drunk, and I don't know who he is. It'll be over if he's sick. Suemo lowered her head and ate the bacon, looking at 1 yuan carefully. Sometimes, Suemo was a little afraid of 1 yuan. Although she often set 1 yuan up, 1 yuan was very good to her. He was so good that he was like Tang Sung reciting scriptures. She could obviously deal with President Yi, so how could 1 yuan take advantage of her? Besides, 1 yuan liked President Yi very much, so Suemo couldn't understand. 1 yuan stared at Suemo and said softly, you know that you'll be finished if you meet someone sick. Then why are you so drunk? Suemo didn't say anything. She stared at 1 yuan while eating breakfast. 1 yuan looked at her and was disappointed. I think you should stop sticking to Kong Qiao. Although he's a little dead, he's clean and has no scandals. Yi Mubai also said that you two are very suitable. Sumo's expression became more and more strange. Clean and neat? Kong Qiao? Does Boss Yi think it's suitable? Could it be that she wasn't awake and was dreaming? If Kong Qiao was not in a mess, who would be? Who is dirty, but not dirty? They were already old friends, and the HIV test was because of him. Now he wanted her to lick her face and chase after this male whore. Was this a joke? Suemo almost ground the breakfast. 1 yuan glared at her. What are you doing? Why is Kong Qiao not better than the men you sleep with outside? Of course, Suemo wouldn't tell him that the person she slept with was Kong Qiao. She put down her fork lazily and put on a fake smile. I'm just a broken flower, so I won't taint Kong Qiao's white lotus. 1 yuan, you see, it's only because I asked him out. As your friend, I'm talking about Kong Qiao. You can't be so unkind. 1 yuan frowned. I don't think he's a virgin. Isn't it normal for adults to have a private life? Suemo ridiculed in his heart. Kong Qiao's private life is not just a little bit, but it's hard to tell how much.
1 yuan thought about it.
Anyway, I'll create an opportunity for you two. Don't drag me down. Didn't you say that you don't feel inferior? I've prepared this for you. 1 yuan took out a pair of prosthetics from his bag and threw them in front of Suemo. Chapter 3969. Mr. Yi, you're too late. Suemo picked up the thing, which looked like liquid. She put it on her chest and said with a fake smile, it seems to be a lot bigger. 1 yuan snorted. Imported from Italy. It looks very real when you put it in your underwear. Suemo weighed it in her hand again and took it off. Unfortunately, a fake is a fake. It can't be real. She leaned on the dining table and looked at 1 yuan, saying pitifully, 1 yuan, I really think it's good now. There's no difference between having a man and not having a man. Look at me, I'm rich and good-looking, but I don't have a man. Besides, the man that night said I was great. When Yuan looked at her suspiciously, Suemo squeezed out a smile. You don't have to get married now. Look at how interesting it is to be single. Right after she said that, when Yuan knocked her on the head. Interesting. Isn't a one-night stand interesting? You'll find it interesting when you get infected with HIV. Suemo murmured, You're pushing me into the fire because of that white lotus. But when Yuan didn't hear it clearly, he wanted to ask again, but Suemo wouldn't say anything when Yuan didn't say anything more. After leaving, she thought about it and went to Yimubai's company. She wanted to talk to him about letting Suemo go. As soon as she arrived, Secretary he came up and whispered, Seo Yi is meeting Miss Liu. When Yuan saw that she was very respectful, so he asked, Are you from the company? No, it's from an American film company. It's very famous internationally. CEO Yi wants to invite her to be the female lead in his next film. So, he went to pick her up today, Secretary he said honestly. When Yuan nodded and smiled. Then I won't bother you anymore. Don't tell anyone that I was here. When Yuan never asked about Yimubai's work and didn't want to get involved. She always felt that since she had chosen to start over, she would learn to trust others. She left by herself and drove directly to the beauty salon. She tidied up her hair and had her face done. She also specially bought a few sets of clothes and calculated the time to pick up the child. She went home early and cooked, wanting to give Yimubai a surprise because it was his birthday. But it was past 7 and he still hadn't come back. When Yuan called him, after 3 or 4 rings he picked it up. His voice was very gentle. When Yuan? What's the matter? She complained softly. I cooked and I also did my hair.
He laughed.
Are you waiting for me to eat? She said yes, and then said that it was his birthday, and he had forgotten. Yimubai paused for a moment before he remembered. He smiled and said, Then I'll come back earlier, okay? We'll talk about business. 9:30. When Yuan nodded. Okay, I'll wait for you. Yimubai wanted to say something, but he restrained himself because of the presence of a third party. He smiled and said that he would go home in a while. When he hung up the phone, the woman across the table smiled and said, Mubai, happy birthday.
He was stunned again.
Then, he looked at the exquisitely wrapped gift and smiled faintly. Lu Man, thank you. He still accepted it without being too pretentious. He had eaten with Lu Man because there were still some details to discuss. There was no reason for her to go hungry after 6, so he chose a nearby restaurant. He had forgotten that it was his birthday, but the 2 women reminded him there were many details of the cooperation. After discussing with Lu Man, he sent her back to the hotel first and then drove home. When he got out of the car, he looked at the gift box and opened it. I'll update tomorrow at noon. End of this chapter. Chapter 30, 970. There was a luxury watch inside, which was worth about 5 or 600,000 yuan. Lu Man had chosen it very tastefully. He looked at it quietly and didn't bring it home. He just left it in the front compartment of the car and didn't care too much about it. He got out of the car and walked towards the living room of the villa. It was almost 10 o'clock. There was only a small light in the living room. The light in the bedroom upstairs was on. He walked in, and a servant immediately came up to him. Sir, Madam has been waiting for you all night. Yimubai paused for a moment and then frowned. Is Wen Yuan asleep? He just went upstairs not long ago. I don't think he's asleep yet. The servant paused for a moment. Sir, do you want me to prepare supper for you? No need. Yimubai carried his coat upstairs and slowly walked up the stairs. He went to see Xiangnan and Yi Hui. Wen Yuan took good care of them. The 2 little ones were sleeping side by side and looked as cute as 2 piglets. He took turns kissing them. Unexpectedly, Xiangnan wasn't asleep. He opened his eyes and said, Daddy. Yimubai smiled, and his voice was soft and gentle. Why aren't you asleep yet? I was just about to fall asleep when Daddy came back, Xiangnan said softly, and then reached out to hug him. Daddy, happy birthday. Yimubai's heart was indescribably soft. He hugged Xiangnan back and said, "Thank you, son." Xiangnan closed his eyes obediently. After a while, he said with a red face, "Yi Hui and I made a card for you. It's in my little school bag. Also, Daddy, good night." Yimubai's heart was incredibly soft. He lowered his head and kissed his forehead. "Daddy will go. Good boy, go to sleep." He covered the two children with a quilt. Little Yi Hui was originally sleeping side by side, but now she turned over and hugged Xiangnan like a little piglet. Xiangnan hugged the little piglet with one hand. He was full of brotherly strength. Yimubai looked at him and felt warm in his heart. He kissed the little piglet again and then left the room to go to the study. He quietly found the card that Xiangnan was talking about. It was originally just a beige card, but Xiangnan and Yi Fenghui used leaves, grass, and cloth to paste a home on it. There was a house, a yard, a lawn, and 4 people. It was a family of 4. They looked very similar. Little Yi Hui was even holding her brother's hand. They were very loving. Yimubai looked at it quietly. His eyes were a little warm, and he couldn't express how touched he was. Once upon a time, he was very indifferent to his family. Even when he was in his early 30s, he did not think about getting married. Later, he missed out on Lin Sisi, so he felt that it did not matter whether he got married or not. But now, his mood was completely different. He never knew that having a complete family would be so wonderful. And all of this was brought to him by Wen Yuan. He took the card back to the master bedroom. Wen Yuan was already asleep. She was wearing a cherry blossom pink silk pajamas. She was half lying on the quilt and half of her body was outside. He looked at her quietly and smiled helplessly. He covered her with the quilt. When he was about to take a shower, Wen Yuan had already woken up. She held his hand, and her voice was a little fuzzy. "You're back." He nodded and leaned over to kiss her lips. Wen Yuan was kissed by him for a while in a daze. She suddenly frowned. "There's a smell of perfume." He was stunned for a moment, and then smiled. "I was talking to an actress today. It might be the smell of her perfume." Wen Yuan hugged his neck. "Did you have dinner with her?" He smiled faintly. "I invited her to dinner. I came all the way from New York." Chapter 3971. He kissed her again, and Wen Yuan was kissed in a daze. Then he seemed to recall something. "You didn't treat artists to meals before, then." She pushed him away. "Moreover, it's your birthday today." He chuckled. "Are you angry?" He lifted his body slightly and reached out to touch her face. "We've worked together before. She was the female lead in my first movie when I became a director." Wen Yuan looked at him and suddenly asked, "Have you ever slept with her?" Yimubai was stunned. He didn't expect Wen Yuan to ask this. Then he laughed. "Nonsense, how could I?" He got up. "I'm going to take a shower. I'll be with you later, okay?" Wen Yuan held on to him. Then he leaned against the headboard. She sat in his arms and unbuttoned his shirt one by one. Finally, she pulled the collar of his shirt and leaned over. "Throw this shirt away," he laughed. "Throw it away just because it smells a little?" "Wen Yuan, this is the shirt you bought for me." Wen Yuan looked at him seriously and seemed to be thinking about something. After a long time, he smiled. "If you touch someone else one day, I'll throw you away too." Yimubai stared into her eyes and suddenly reached out to hold the back of her head. He fiercely kissed her lips and ravaged them to his heart's content. It wasn't until her lips were a little swollen that he released her and said hoarsely, "I won't give you this chance, Wen Yuan." The shirt was thrown on the floor. He folded her in his arms and kissed her again and again, until she was lying on his shoulder and biting his shoulder so hard that it almost bled. He turned her face over and kissed her fiercely. They burned for half the night. When it was over, the big bed could no longer be seen. He carried her to the shower and then let her soak in the warm water. He went to change the bedsheets. When Wen Yuan changed into his pajamas and lay on the bed again, she was already asleep. Yimubai quietly cleaned up. When he threw the shirt into the trash, his eyes flickered. He held the sink and looked at the mirror for a long time. Then he smiled. He would never allow Wen Yuan to leave. Returning to the bed in the bedroom, she automatically moved over and whispered, "I waited for you for a long time tonight." He smiled and looked down at the woman in his arms. "Now, can I prove my innocence?" When Yuan didn't say anything, only hugging his waist, looking extremely tired. He wanted to smoke a cigarette, but he held it in. After a long while, he remembered that they had been interacting very well with each other recently. When Yuan had taken a lot more initiative. Although it was said that she had something to ask of him, he really felt that she had really let it go. She wanted to live well with him, and she wanted to love him properly. She didn't want to make do. Her heart warmed as she leaned over and whispered, "I won't betray you, When Yuan." When Yuan grunted vaguely and fell asleep. Before going to bed, she whispered, "Don't forget about the class reunion in a few days." Yi Mubai smiled. "I won't forget." The next morning, when Yuan woke up early, because the children were disappointed yesterday, she wanted to make them happy today. Yi Mubai drove the children to school. She sat in the front passenger seat, but she always smelled a faint perfume in the car, which was very similar to the smell on him yesterday. When Yuan didn't want to think too much, so she said softly, "I'll drive the car for maintenance later." Yi Mubai didn't understand what she meant. He smiled. "Let the assistant do it. I have nothing to do anyway." She looked at him. Chapter 3972. He didn't think much about it, thinking that it was good that she had nothing to do. So, after sending the two children over, he drove back to the company, and when Yuan drove his car directly to the maintenance office. Stopping there, the staff said respectfully, "Mrs. Yi, please check if there are any valuables in the car." When Yuan nodded and sat in the car, looking around. Finally, he found a very delicate box in the front compartment. She was stunned for a moment, then opened it. There was a man's watch inside. She recognized it as the brand that Yi Mubai usually wore. He couldn't have bought it because he was the kind of man who wouldn't change a new one if he wasn't bad. He had worn that one for several years, and when Yuan moved closer to his nose and sniffed, there was a faint scent of perfume. Her expression slowly became serious. Was this a gift from the actress from last night? Her intuition told her that the relationship between this woman and Yi Mubai wasn't so innocent, or at least there was a story between them. It wasn't normal for a woman to give a man a watch, a tie, or a belt, not to mention this watch was worth 5 or 600,000 yuan. How could she give it away so easily? When Yuan thought about it and left the things there, she got out of the car and waited in the waiting area. She had nothing to do, so she started to scroll through her phone, searching for top 10 symptoms of husband cheating. The results were all the smell of perfume, coming home late, the gifts that appeared next to her that weren't bought by herself. After looking at a few of them, when Yuan felt that he had hit all of them, she put away her phone and let out a long sigh, feeling a little depressed. After the car was serviced, she drove his car to his company. She didn't go in, but sat in the car and called Secretary He. "Secretary He, is your CEO, Yi, busy now?" Secretary He didn't think much about it. "Oh, the cooperation yesterday didn't come to an agreement. Miss Lu Man is here." Lu Man. When Yuan knew that she was a famous female star who had made it to Hollywood. Her acting skills were very good, but she didn't know if her acting skills were useful in real life. She thought that the person who gave the gift to him last night must have been this Miss Lu. When Yuan's voice was very calm, "Tell CEO Yi that I left the car key at the front desk." Secretary He was surprised and wanted to say something, but when Yuan had already hung up, she opened the car door and got out, slammed the door, and handed the car key to the front desk. When she left, her phone rang.
It was Yi Mubai.
Secretary He must have told him. When Yuan picked it up, his voice was very soft. "I'm going home now." Yi Mubai sensed her coldness and pulled his tie. "What's wrong? Weren't you fine just now?" "It's nothing, just a little tired," she murmured. "I'll ask the driver to send me back. I'll pick up Xiangnan and Yihui later. I want to go back to my mother's place tonight. Do you want to go?" Yi Mubai looked at Secretary He. "Do you have a schedule for tonight?" "CEO Yi, I have a cocktail party to attend tonight." Secretary He naturally hoped that CEO Yi would be in a good mood, so he suggested, "Why don't you invite Madam to attend with you?" Yi Mubai pondered for a moment and said to Wen Yuan, "I'll pick you up later." Wen Yuan was silent. After a long time, she said, "Mubai, can you explain the gift in your car?" She had wanted to endure it and choose to believe him, but it was obvious that he didn't want to say anything when he stayed in the car. Wen Yuan wasn't someone who was willing to be bullied. Besides, she didn't have to beg him to be with her this time. She had said that if he cheated on her and dirted himself, she wouldn't want him. Chapter 3973. It was fine for him to discuss business, to have a meal with others, and even when he was stained with a woman's perfume, she could tolerate it and understand. But this woman had given him an expensive gift, and he had accepted it, hiding it from her. Even though their cooperation was still ongoing, he had allowed this ambiguity to grow. Or perhaps they had always had ambiguity in the past. This was something Wen Yuan couldn't tolerate. She was waiting for him to explain. Yi Mubai sat quietly. On the sofa opposite him was Lu Man, the alluring Lu Man. In his heart, the matter with Lu Man was already over. To him, Lu Man was just a partner, and it was a film that he valued. He had chosen many actresses, but in the end, only Lu Man could act. As for Wen Yuan, he had probably sensed something, or perhaps he was unhappy about what happened last night. He coaxed, "Let's talk at home, all right?" Wen Yuan sat in the chauffeur's car and said quietly, "Yi Mubai, if I don't find out, will you pretend nothing happened? Will you continue to have a meal with a woman who has ulterior motives towards you, send her back to the hotel, or accept her invitation to have a cup of coffee or red wine?" Her eyes were a little hot. "Yi Mubai, what kind of person do you think I am?" After saying that, she hung up the phone. It was probably a woman's intuition, a gift that allowed her to guess the story. Lu Man was a woman who had a story with him. When Yuan didn't want to listen to his explanation, she just wanted his attitude. He hadn't signed a contract with Lu Man. He could choose not to sign it. He could choose not to do a project, or let someone else talk to her. He would send her back and forth for meals, and spend his birthday with Lu Man. What was a wife to him? A tool to accompany him to bed and have sex with him every night? She couldn't have her dreams. She had to sacrifice everything for him. She had to be a housewife for the family, but he wasn't even willing to give up on a project. He said he loved her, but she found it ridiculous, like a joke. Go to hell. Yi Mubai looked at his phone and frowned, then told Secretary He, "Cancel my schedule tonight." Secretary He hesitated for a moment before asking, "What about during the day? If Madam ran away, wouldn't he chase after her?" Yi Mubai frowned. "I'm talking about a collaboration, Secretary He. Since when did you lose your cool like Wen Yuan?" Secretary He wanted to say something, but hesitated. No matter how slow she was, she knew what Wen Yuan was up to. From her point of view, family came first. This Miss Liu could have easily settled the collaboration. Why did she have to discuss it so many times? Wasn't she just trying to create opportunities? She felt that CEO Yi had gone too far. It was work, but it had already jeopardized the harmony of the family. Was there a need to continue talking? She trusted Wen Yuan. If there wasn't any concrete evidence, she wouldn't have exploded. Secretary, he didn't say anything. He watched as the assistant representatives and lawyers from both sides continued to discuss the contract. Lu Man was a big shot and had a strong attitude. But in private, she was very gentle when facing Yi Mubai. Secretary He noticed this too. She didn't say anything. Anyway, if CEO Yi wanted to court death, then let him do it. Sometimes, it's called cheating when it's not a man who rolls around in bed with someone else. Letting yourself be ambiguous is also a kind of cheating. However, CEO Yi didn't seem to feel that he had gone too far. By the time Yi Mubai finished his work, it was already 9 o'clock at night. Only then did he remember Wen Yuan and the children. Lu Man asked her assistant and lawyer to leave first. She stood in front of Yi Mubai and smiled. "Mubai, do you want to go for supper? You must be tired after a long day." "It's getting late, next time." He raised his hand to look at his watch and smiled apologetically. Chapter 3974. Lu Man looked at the watch on his hand. It wasn't the one she gave him. Her voice was gentle. Mubai, don't you like my gift? It's not bad, but Wen Yuan might not be happy if I wear it. Thank you, Lu Man. Yi Mubai's voice was faint. Lu Man, I'm a professional person. You should understand. The meaning of his words was clear. Lu Man knew it, but she wasn't one of those lowly actresses. She had always taken a step back in order to advance. She still smiled faintly. Don't think too much, Mubai, we're friends. Do you need me to explain it to your wife? No need, Yi Mubai said faintly, then dialed the intercom. Secretary, please send Miss Lu out. Lu Man smiled and said that it was okay. She left gracefully, looking as beautiful as ever. In the entertainment industry, there weren't many people who could escape Lu Man's charm. She had the chance to marry into a rich family, but she still hadn't gotten married in her early 30s. Perhaps it was to maintain the freshness of her career. Lu Man left, and Secretary, he came in. He didn't say anything, just looked at Yi Mubai. Yi Mubai lit a cigarette, took a puff, and said faintly, Hina, I know what you want to say. Lu Man and I are just business, nothing else. Secretary, he said softly. All women care. When Yuan stays at home every day, she's actually very sensitive. CEO Yi, I know how much you care about the movie industry, but please take her feelings into consideration. She's just a woman. She doesn't really care about how successful the movie is or how much money it earns. She only cares if her husband cares about her. Perhaps, CEO, you would have an answer if you put yourself in her shoes. Yi Mubai frowned slightly, looking at Secretary. It's not that serious. He loved Wen Yuan, so he would keep his distance from Lu Man. There shouldn't be any ambiguity between them. Secretary, he smiled and didn't say anything else. Yi Mubai took his coat and walked out. He called Wen Yuan as he walked, but Wen Yuan didn't pick up. He went down to the car and called a few more times, but she didn't pick up. Yi Mubai put down the phone, then took out the box from the front cabinet and opened it. Wen Yuan must have seen it. She must have smelled it. That's why she offered to wash his car. He looked at the watch, then opened the car door, walked to a trash can on the side of the building and threw it in. When he got back to the car, he directly started the car and went to Wen's house. However, when he arrived, Wen's mother said that Wen Yuan had already taken the child back. Probably because she saw that he didn't look well, Wen's mother said softly, Wen Yuan's temper isn't very good. It's nothing. Even if she is angry with me, I will coax her. Yi Mubai patted Mother Wen's shoulder and turned to leave. He opened the door and got in. Just as he was about to start the car, Wen Qing appeared out of nowhere. Wen Qing knocked on the car window, and Yi Mubai rolled down the window. Wen Qing smiled sweetly and said, Brother-in-law, did you secretly eat outside? Is that why Wen Yuan is fighting with you? Yi Mubai asked. Yi Mubai ignored her and rolled up the car window, leaving the exhaust for Wen Qing. Wen Qing was so angry that she stomped her foot. Wen Yuan is a fool, but I'm not. She had read the newspaper. That bitch called Lu Man had ulterior motives. She even said that it was the second time she was happy working with CEO Yi. They must have worked together in bed before. That was why Wen Yuan minded it so much. She knew it. How could there be anything good in a man? Wen Yuan was such a fool. He thought she was so blessed. Chapter 39-75. Yi Mubai drove back to the villa and dialed Wen Yuan's number as he drove. She still didn't pick up. He gave up and sped up the car back to the villa. As soon as he got out of the car, he caught a servant and asked, Is Wen Yuan back? The servant was stunned for a moment and immediately said, Madam will be back after 8 o'clock. She should be asleep now. Yi Mubai gestured for her to rest. He stood in the dark and smoked a cigarette before walking into the living room. He slowly went upstairs and went straight to the master bedroom. Wen Yuan didn't sleep. She leaned against the headboard in her pajamas and looked at him quietly. Yi Mubai was also looking at her. Finally, he walked in and stood by the bed. He reached out and touched her head. Wen Yuan, you're thinking too much. Lu Man and I are just partners. I only brought a gift because we know each other. He paused for a moment and said, I threw that watch away. When Yuan looked up and asked hoarsely after a long time, "You sign a contract with her?" He nodded and sat on the sofa next to the bed. Then he said indifferently, "I talked to the director, and he insisted on using Lu Man. No one else can play this role well except Lu Man." When Yuan smiled. "So you won't care about my feelings and will still see her often in the future, right?" Yimubai paused for a moment. "That's also for work." When Yuan looked at him with tears in his eyes. "Yimubai, you've slept with her, haven't you?" Yimubai stared at her with shock in his eyes. He didn't say a word for a long time. When Yuan closed his eyes and his eyelashes couldn't stop trembling, she suddenly grabbed a pillow and threw it at him. Her voice was hoarse as she shouted, "Get lost. Yimubai, get out, I don't want to see you." The pillow landed on his face and then fell off. His expression was a bit ugly. When Yuan calmed down, "That was in the past. I can let go of what happened in the past, but why did you bring a woman who had slept with you to be city to disgust me, Yimubai? You said there was no one else but her." "Yes, that's because you've seen her acting skills and how she looked in your bed." When Yuan's eyes were full of tears, she clenched her fists and her voice was almost hysterical. After saying that, her whole body was stiff and trembling. Yimubai wanted to reach out and touch her, but her lips were trembling. Her voice was sharp, and she seemed to be scared herself. Then she murmured, "Don't touch me, really, don't touch me." In the end, she still burst into tears. She looked at him tearfully and said, "Yimubai, you really disappoint me." If she hadn't found out, he would have continued to see Lu Man. That woman would have continued to interfere with their lives. Perhaps one night when they were drunk, they would have rolled into bed again. He said that he wouldn't betray his marriage and her. The real betrayal was to put an end to all ambiguity, not to think that he wouldn't. Interacting with, and even giving gifts to a woman he had slept with was also betrayal. After when Yuan finished speaking, her nose was red and her eyes were moist. She lifted the blanket and said, "I'm going to sleep in the guest room." Yimubai grabbed her hand and said in a low voice, When Yuan closed his eyes slightly, "I want to calm down." She looked up at him. "You too. Do you want to continue working with Lu Man, or continue our marriage?" "Yimubai, don't treat me like an idiot and talk about separating work from work. Don't tell me that you can't tell that Lu Man has ulterior motives towards you, and don't tell me that you won't contact each other after this film is finished. Please don't disgust me, and don't disgust our marriage. You want me to be loyal, but I will also ask you to be loyal. Wen Yuan, can tell you right now that I can live a life of luxury, and I can even live a simple life. Don't threaten me with children. I'll give you everything you want." She waved his hand hard, but she couldn't break free. Yimubai grabbed her, and there was a storm in his eyes. "It sounds like you've made up your mind, but Wen Yuan, do you think I'm the kind of bastard who will do anything to a woman?" He grabbed her and dragged her in front of him. "Or, do you think I'll definitely betray you, huh?" Wen Yuan couldn't break free. She hit his shoulder desperately and cried, "Let go of me. Yimubai, you've already betrayed me." He held her waist with one hand and held her firmly in his arms. Then he stared at her with a deathly stare. His breath was cold and hot. "Wen Yuan, do you know what you're saying?" She looked up, embarrassed and panting. "I know what I'm saying, Yimubai. It's you who don't know what you're saying." He lowered his voice. "What do you want me to do? Cancel the contract? Give up a chance to get an Oscar? Wen Yuan, that's my dream and career. Do you want me to give it up?" She stared at him for a long time before she smiled and said in a very soft voice, "Yes, that's your dream. Only Lu Man can realize it, isn't it? Let me ask you now, if your dream affects your family and my mood, will you continue?" "It won't affect anything." His voice became even lower. "It's just work." "Then how did you and her start? How did you get into bed? Did you get excited when you talked about work so you naturally rolled into bed with her?" Wen Yuan smiled coldly. "Yimubai, I won't say anything about how you get along with Su Mo and Secretary He, but if you insist on cooperating with a woman who has slept with you and wants to continue eating with her, then send her back and let her sit in your car. I'm sorry, but I don't have that kind of tolerance. Let someone else be Mrs. Yi, and let someone else put up with you. He stared at her eyes, reached out, and lifted her up so that her face was level with his. He said in a hoarse voice, "When Yuan, say that again." Her throat was tight, but she still said in a low voice, "Yi Mubai, find someone else to be Mrs. Yi. When Yuan, you don't have a heart." He suddenly let go of her and stood there. After a long time, he took out a cigarette and lightly lit it. After smoking half a cigarette, he turned to look at Wen Yuan and said quietly, "I'll sleep in the guest room if you want to calm down." He wanted to leave, but Wen Yuan stopped him. "It's your decision." He frowned and looked down at her. He wanted to calm down and give her time, but he didn't want to let her go since she was forcing him. Yi Mubai put out the cigarette, grabbed her wrist, and pushed her against the wall. She was almost sitting on his lap, and she struggled after a moment. "Yi Mubai, let go of me. Bastard, let go of me." Chapter 3976. He didn't let go. Not only did he not let go, but he also kissed her too much. His mouth was filled with the taste of tobacco and a faint scent of perfume that she couldn't ignore. Wen Yuan didn't want to do it with him, so he forced himself on her and kissed her like a madman. He pinned her to the wall and kissed her again and again. After a few times, Wen Yuan was so weak that she was at his mercy. He was firm and strong, while she was as soft as a puddle of water. Wen Yuan, stop fooling around, HM? His face was buried in her neck. Every breath he took was obviously restrained, showing his extreme pleasure at that moment. He enjoyed himself to the fullest while Wen Yuan kept crying. She couldn't break free from him and was embarrassed and embarrassed. She didn't want to make a fuss and let everyone in the house know about it. She also didn't want the two children to see the way their parents interacted, as if they were raping each other. She could only endure it, but he was still not satisfied. His hot lips pressed against her ear, and he murmured sexily, "Why aren't you moaning, Wen Yuan?" "I want to hear you moan," he forced her again, and she cried out, "Yi Mubai, let me go." His voice was low and hoarse. "Are you not feeling well? Wen Yuan, look at you now. You clearly like me, but you have to pretend that you're being forced, HM?" He carried her to the bathroom and put her in front of the mirror to torture her. "Look at yourself." She closed her eyes and didn't speak. She endured it and didn't want to talk to him. He continued to torture her until she broke down. Later, when Yuan was placed on the soft bed, he leaned on her back and comforted her. He nibbled on her shoulder and murmured, "I only do this with you, HM? Are you still angry?" He even licked and kissed behind her ear. "You're not angry anymore, hm?" When Yuan lay there weakly and let him do whatever he wanted. Her voice was hoarse. "Yi Mubai, do you really think that sex can solve everything? I just want you to be happy, Wen Yuan. Forget about those things. They are all in the past." He hugged her from behind and said slowly. Wen Yuan closed his eyes. "If Lu Man is unwilling, will you satisfy her once and let her continue acting?" Her words completely infuriated Yi Mubai. He left her body and got off the bed. After sitting on the edge of the bed for a while, he said in a hoarse voice, "Wen Yuan, maybe you're right. Calm down." After that, he went straight to the bathroom, took a shower, put on a bathrobe, and went to the guest room. The door was gently closed, and Wen Yuan was still lying there quietly. She felt very empty. She had told him so much, but he still didn't understand. Perhaps this was the difference between them. He thought she was making a big deal out of it, and she thought he was betraying her to some extent. She didn't get up to take a shower. She just lay there and didn't sleep a wink all night. She cried. She felt some wrong pay. When she was young, she chose a man because of her heart. After marriage, she fell in love with him again because of a song. Only now, when he told her to scream and asked if her anger had subsided, did she realize that she was nothing in his heart. The person she fell in love with first was destined to be lowly. If Lin Cece was his wife, would he still treat her like this? When Yuan knew that he wouldn't. Tears flowed down from the corner of her eyes. She wiped them away, but when they came out again, she wiped them away again. She didn't want to cry. Chapter 3977. Early the next morning, when Yi Mubai returned to the master bedroom to pick up his clothes, when Yuan was still asleep, he approached her gently and stood by the bed. She was lying on the bed with her black hair covering half of her face. He brushed it aside. Her face was so pale that it was almost transparent, and her lips were even paler. Yi Mubai's heart skipped a beat. He sat by the bed and stroked her face gently. He said hoarsely, "When Yuan, I'll take you to the hospital, okay?" She woke up and opened her eyes. Yi Mubai was in front of her. When Yuan didn't want to talk to him, she buried her face in the pillow. "I don't want to go." Yi Mubai put his hand on her shoulder. "When Yuan, don't be angry, okay? I'll take you to the hospital." "I don't want to, I'm fine." She turned her back. "Yi Mubai, can you not care about me? You only need to care about whether your film will win an award and whether Lu Man will be part of it." His expression froze, and then he said in a low voice, "Are you still angry?" "When Yuan, I said that I won't work with my personal feelings. The contract has been signed, and Lu Man will be on the set next month. I have nothing to do with her." When Yuan didn't say anything and lay there quietly. As a woman with ulterior motives, she would always create some opportunities. Yi Mubai was also angry. "What do you want?" "I don't want anything. I just want the woman you've slept with to disappear from our lives forever." When Yuan said very softly, her face buried in the quilt, "If you can't do it, there's nothing to talk about between us." Not to mention that he had forced himself on her last night. Yi Mubai looked at her quietly for a long time before he said bitterly, "The contract has been signed. Our company isn't the only one producing this film, but I'm the one who chose the director. When Yuan, I hope you can be more understanding." Maybe he paused for a moment. "You've been living too comfortably at home these past few years. That's why you can't understand me. Yes, Lu Man and I did have a past, but those things are already in the past. It's not a big deal at all. If you keep taking it to heart, then there's no way to get over it." After he said that, he felt a little impulsive and regretful, so he said bitterly, "When Yuan, I mean calm down. Today is the press conference for the new film. I hope you can let go of all this. After you're done with your work, I'll take you abroad to relax." When Yuan listened quietly, and then smiled. "Yi Mubai, thank you for giving me such a good life. Otherwise, how would I know what I want?" He frowned. "When Yuan." She smiled again and lifted the blanket. Standing in front of him, she said softly, "Calm down. I'm not going abroad. And, Yi Mubai, remember what I said. If you're dirty, I won't want you." After she finished speaking, she walked into the changing room and stopped talking to him. Yi Mubai clenched his fists and didn't say anything for a long time. When Wen Yuan came out, he had already left with Xiangnan and Yi Hui. Wen Yuan stood quietly for a while. Later, she made an appointment to meet Su Mo. Su Mo had just recovered from her cold. She had originally planned to go to work, but Wen Yuan seemed to have something important to do, so she made an appointment at a cafe. Wen Yuan said, "Su Mo, I want to find an apartment, 140 square meters, with 2 children's rooms. It's next to Xiangnan and Yi Hui's school." Su Mo frowned. "Wen Yuan, what's wrong?" This was the rhythm of a separation. "Help me find one first. I might not necessarily move there. The monthly rent is about 30,000 yuan, and the environment should be better." When Yuan paused. "Do you know Lu Man?" Chapter 3978. Su Mo was stunned for a moment before she said uncomfortably, "Why are you asking about her?" From Su Mo's reaction, Wen Yuan knew that she knew about the past. Wen Yuan did not ask further and only said, "Help me look for her." She took out a card and gave it to Su Mo. "There's $1 million in here. You can rent it for 3 years." 3 years? Su Mo was stunned for a moment. Wen Yuan, that's all in the past. You probably don't know this, but Lu Man has come to B City to shoot a movie together. Anything can happen during the half-a-year shoot. Su Mo, I don't want to fight without a place to stay, Wen Yuan said calmly. Of course, she still had the house that Yi Mulan had left for her, but Wen Yuan did not want to go there. She wanted to find a new place to live with their child, if that day ever came. Suemo was stunned for a long time before she said in a hoarse voice, "What happened?" Wen Yuan said softly, "Lu Man, you should know. Maybe it's a woman's intuition. Lu Man is stepping between me and Yimu by step, and he doesn't know anything." Suemo grabbed her hand. "Wen Yuan, are you stupid? If you give in like this, won't you be giving other women a chance?" Wen Yuan's expression was bitter. "Suemo, if I keep pleasing him, will I still be me? Then I won't be me anymore. I'll be fighting for a man every day and swallowing all the grievances. I was even forced to give up the job that I liked. Now that I think about it, it's such a joke." As she spoke, her fingers trembled slightly as she held the coffee cup and took a sip. Then, she smiled at Suemo helplessly. Suemo felt that it was right. Yeah, it's not worth it for a stinky man. He can live with whoever he wants. Wen Yuan shook his head. "Our problem has existed for a long time. Lu Man is just the fuse." She lowered her eyes again. "Also, I contacted the school where I used to work. I'm going to start working." Suemo was stunned again, but then she agreed.
Yes.
"Why don't women work at home? It's as if he's the one supporting you." "Suemo, look at my hair. A perm costs tens of thousands, a bag costs hundreds of thousands, and a set of clothes costs at least 20 to 30,000. It's all bought with money, so I don't even have the right to get mad at him. His dream is just a dream, and my dream is nothing at all." Wen Yuan chuckled. "You're right." Suemo did not know what to say. She felt that Wen Yuan had suffered a loss. Back then, they had gotten married for Xiangnan. Later on, Yimubai had almost caused Wen Yuan to have a miscarriage for Lin Cece. Now that their relationship had finally recovered, he had sacrificed Wen Yuan for a stupid film. Wen Yuan was always the one who had to make sacrifices and give in. Suemo was sad, so she asked in a low voice, "Do you still love him?" Wen Yuan shook his head. "I don't know either. I don't think I love him, but I still have feelings for him. I say I love him, but I feel like I really can't communicate with him. He can't even give me the most basic guarantee." For a moment, Suemo did not know what to say. Wen Yuan finished his cup of coffee and said in a low voice, "Let me know when you find the house. Also, don't tell Yimubai. Just find someone to clean it for me." Suemo agreed. Her emotions were rather complicated. Wen Yuan was feeling down, but he still thought about Suemo and Kong Qiao. Hence he said, "You and Kong Qiao. If it's possible, you can take the initiative. Kong Qiao is pretty good." Chapter 3979. Sumo's expression was a little strange, and he almost choked on his coffee. He coughed lightly and said, "It's pretty good, it's pretty good." Wen Yuan looked at her again. "Be more careful." Suemo protested. "Actually, being single is pretty good. There are no worries." Wen Yuan did not say anything else. After having another meal with Suemo, she went to the school in the afternoon to meet with the leader in charge. They had tea together and discussed the matter of salary. From Monday to Friday, she would have one class every day, from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. The schedule was quite good, and the salary was not bad. Although it was not a lot, this was Wen Yuan's major and interest. She wanted to be a calm and ordinary person like a teacher. When she finished talking about work and walked out of the school, she saw that it was exactly 3:30, so she called the driver and told him that she was going to pick up the children. Xiangnan and Yihui's schools were next to each other, so after she picked up the children, Xiangnan would be picking up Yihui. Wen Yuan drove back and let the two children get off the car. The servants at home had a strange expression on their faces. "What's wrong?" Wen Yuan took the things he had bought out of the car. One of the servants hesitated for a moment. Sir called and said that he wouldn't be coming back for dinner. He said that he had something to do in the company. Wen Yuan asked as he walked, "It's normal to work overtime in the company. Why are you stuttering?" As she spoke, she paused for a moment as she recalled that he had said that there would be a press conference for the film called Star today. It should be a celebration party, but the servant's expression didn't look right. Wen Yuan put down his things and asked, "What's wrong?" "This is today's newspaper." The servant brought the newspaper and said, "Madam, we should not meddle in your private affairs with Sir, but this woman is an entertainer, and all entertainers know how to act. We are afraid you will suffer a loss." She pointed at one of the photos. "Madam, this woman is obviously faking it. How could she look so weak? She just happened to fall into Sir's arms." These reporters wrote terrible things. This bad woman deliberately destroyed other people's families. She looks pretty, but she's actually very bad inside. When Yuan quietly looked at the photo in the newspaper, he watched as Lu Man collapsed on Yi Mubai's shoulder, exhausted, and their eyes met. She pursed her lips and smiled faintly. "You can see it, and Sir will also see it. It's nothing. There are many women like that." The servant was still worried, but when Yuan had no intention of continuing the conversation, the servant could only give up. When Yuan packed up her things and had dinner with the two children, she then looked at Xiangnan's homework and Yi Hui's crafts. She waited for the two children to go to bed before she returned to her bedroom. Unexpectedly, Yi Mubai came back. He was still wearing the suit he had worn in the morning, but he had taken off his jacket and put it aside. He sat there quietly and looked at her. When Yuan smiled faintly at the door, "You have something to tell me?" He stared at her and said hoarsely, "When Yuan, you saw the newspaper, didn't you? There are also photos of you on the internet." When Yuan walked in slowly, she didn't stand beside him. Instead, she chose to stand in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. She was wearing a dark green dress today. Her long black hair flowed down her back, making her look very feminine. The curves on her back were especially soft and beautiful, and Yi Mubai always liked to do it with her from behind. When Yuan stood quietly, after a while he said, "Mubai, you know very well what Lu Man wants, but you still chose to cooperate with her and let me bear all of this. You should know my choice." Chapter 3980. It's just an accident. Lu Man needs to stay in the hospital for a few days. He said indifferently, "It's not what you're thinking." When Yuan smiled faintly, "Maybe. But Yi Mubai, I don't want to be suspicious. I don't want to doubt whether you're betraying me all day, so I'm going to work." His voice suddenly became hoarse and low. "When Yuan, have you decided to tell me?" She turned her head slowly and smiled faintly. "Aren't you the same? Yi Mubai, if you don't agree, you want a divorce and leave me, right?" His voice was a little cold. He walked step by step to her, bent down, and stared at her face. "Lu Man is your excuse." When Yuan stared at him and didn't give in, he gently pinched her face. "You just want to go to work or leave me, right?" When Yuan didn't get angry, but laughed. She stared at the man she used to love very much and smiled gently. "Yi Mubai, you said that I don't have a heart. I want to ask you, do you? Did you, Yi Mubai, really love me? If you loved me, you wouldn't do this to me, over and over again." Her lips trembled a little. "If you love me, it doesn't mean that you sleep with me a few times every night. That's called loving me. You take care of my feelings and treat me as an independent person. You think that the woman who can stand by your side will always be called Wen Yuan. That's how you love me. Really, I hate having sex with you without love. You might feel good about it, but let me tell you, it's really disgusting. You probably don't know that the smell of perfume on you reminds me of how you used to roll on the sheets with Lu Man." His face looked terrible. When Yuan closed her eyes, "Because you don't love me enough, you don't care about these details. Yi Mubai, what you think of as love is just guilt." She, on the other hand, had taken his attempts to please and please her, or his subservient acts of love, as emotions. All he did was sit with her and play a song, and she easily fell for him. She was willing to stay at home obediently, and whenever she wanted to go out to work, she would hug him and take the initiative to please him. She would even bring food to his mouth for him to eat. Her careful fawning was exchanged for Lu Man's appearance. "Yi Mubai, why should I put up with this?" She sneered. "If Mrs. Yi has a price, I can't accept betrayal and sharing." She did not love him blindly. She, Wen Yuan, also had her own pride. She could leave at any time. He lit a cigarette and looked at her quietly, as if he had never known her before. After a long time, he said with difficulty, "Nothing happened. I won't sleep with her, and you can't act like it's another woman." When Yuan's breath caught in his throat, he asked softly, "You're turning a blind eye, aren't you?" She pursed her lips and her eyes reddened. She didn't say anything else and turned her head away. She looked at the lights outside and felt a little lonely. For a period of time, when Yuan always thought that she had a lot of the world, including Yi Mubai's love. At that time, she felt that she was very happy. She would act coquettishly with him and tell him all the words in her heart. She even felt that the most shameful thing in bed was to share intimacy. It turned out that what he wanted was just her body. What he wanted was just to keep a woman named Wen Yuan by his side. She just needed to write her in the spouse column. She just needed to satisfy his wish every night and accompany him to make love. Other things, such as her little feelings, were not important at all. Chapter 3981. When Yuan stood there for a long time, she felt lonely, but now she was alone. He was clearly by her side, but she couldn't feel any warmth. Yi Mubai hugged her from behind and buried his face in her neck. "Wen Yuan, tell me, what can I do to make you not angry? What can I do for you to continue to stay by my side?" Wen Yuan's body froze. She wanted to push him away, but he didn't let her. He hugged her tightly and didn't let her have a chance to break free. When Yuan looked at the night view outside, her eyes a little bitter. "After a long time," she whispered, "Yi Mubai, I want to calm down. I'll move out and bring Xiangnan and Yihui with me. Maybe this way, you can understand which is more important to you, family or career." He turned her around. "Wen Yuan, say that again." "I want to move out." She raised her head and looked at him. "Before what happened today, I had to think about it again, but now I don't want to think about it anymore. I can't stand Lu Man's existence anymore. You still have to go to the hospital to see her tomorrow, right? Yi Mubai, don't ask too much of me. I'm not perfect, and I'm not the kind of decent woman you want. I want my husband to be clean, and this is not an unreasonable request." After saying that, Wen Yuan felt a little sad. She was silent for a moment before continuing. "Yi Mubai, you can continue your career. I won't stop you, but please respect my choice." She lowered her eyes and a tear fell. "Let's forget about it." That tear seemed to have dripped on Yi Mubai's heart, corroding half of it. He heard his heart pounding. Before his rationality came back, he hugged Wen Yuan tightly in his arms. He buried his face in her neck and said hoarsely, "Wen Yuan, you said forget about it. Are you going to break up with me?" He bit her. "How can you bear to?" She didn't move and just laughed softly. She laughed helplessly. "If I don't see her, there won't be any hype. Lu Man will go back to America after she's discharged and start filming immediately. She won't be filming in B City. I won't see her either. I'll take you with me for the post-production publicity." His voice was deep and hoarse. "Don't go, okay?" When Yuan listened to him and was a bit absent-minded, she only came back to her senses when he carried her to a piano next to the floor-to-ceiling window. She looked at him in disbelief with tears falling from her eyes. She hit his shoulder hard. "Yi Mubai, what are you doing? Let go of me." He put her down and pressed his palms against her knees to keep her from moving. He crouched down himself, when Yuan kept crying and struggling, but he was so strong that she could not escape from him. When it was over, he looked up at her. "From today onwards, you'll follow me, okay?" She said no. He straightened his body and hugged her, letting her hug his waist as well. He had been too much just now. When Yuan's face was pressed against the side of his waist, beside her cheek was his cold leather belt. She was a little awake, but also a little unconscious. Later, he carried her to the bed, and when Yuan fell asleep, she didn't know how long she slept. When she woke up, she was the only one on the bed. Yi Mubai stood in the direction of the floor-to-ceiling window. He stood there alone in the dark. When Yuan sat up, he probably knew that she was awake. He said in a low voice, "When Yuan, I've thought about what you said just now. If you want to go to work, then go to work. But you're not allowed to move out, and you're not allowed to ask for a divorce. Chapter 3982. He turned around and looked at her quietly. 1 yuan, I love you, but it's not like what you said. It's not just because I like you and have sex with you, but it's part of marriage, and it's the most important part for a man. He walked over and kissed her. It was a shallow kiss. He didn't want her, but he kissed her for a long time. The storm ended with their concessions. But when Yuan was still indifferent to her, it was impossible for her to please him like before. The next day, Yi Mubai went to the company and sent his children to school. When he arrived at the company, he called Secretary He and paused. Is Manager Su working today? Secretary He was stunned. Manager Su? Anyway, there was a line in Star's Entertainment. The Manager Su that CEO Yi looked for must be Manager Su Mo. Yi Mubai glanced at her. He Na immediately went to summon him. Su Mo came 10 minutes later and sat opposite to Yi Mubai. CEO Yi, what's the matter? Yi Mubai looked up. Did Wen Yuan ask you to find a house? Sumo's face changed, but she immediately denied.
No.
Really no? Yi Mubai smiled faintly. It seems that I can only tell Wen Yuan about your love affair with Kong Qiao. He even checked for HIV. It seems that Kong Qiao's private life is very messy. Do you think Wen Yuan will have a new view of the world after knowing it? The Kong Qiao that he has always recognized is very messy. Su Mo was furious. She stared at Yi Mubai. CEO Yi, you are too mean. You admitted that it was Kong Qiao that night? Yi Mubai smiled and stretched out his hand.
Give me the key.
Su Mo stared at him. In the end, she handed over one key and prepared to give the rest to Wen Yuan. Write down the address. Yi Mubai's voice was indifferent. Su Mo was about to explode again, but after thinking about it, she restrained herself. Wen Yuan, I didn't betray you on purpose. Su Mo wrote down the address and said in a low voice, Don't tell Wen Yuan that I said it. Yi Mubai looked at it for a moment, then put it into the drawer. He paused for a moment, looked at Su Mo, and coughed lightly. Kong Qiao is very good. Su Mo glared at him fiercely, then immediately opened the door and left. He was simply the devil. Yi Mubai smiled, leaned back on the chair, and shook his head. He cared about Wen Yuan, and Wen Yuan cared a lot about Lu Man. Therefore, he would keep his distance from Lu Man. However, the contract had already been signed, and the film had to go on. It was not something that he could stop at any time. As for Lu Man, he sent He Na to visit her. When He Na received the call, Su Morin was still in the secretariat. Seeing He Na hang up the phone, he asked, Secretary He, did CEO Yi send you to the hospital? Secretary He chuckled. Manager Su, you're too amazing. Yes, CEO Yi asked me to go, but I really have a lot of things to do today. I can't help it. Su Mo tapped her butt against the desk and said, How about I go over on your behalf, Secretary He? Lu Man and I are considered old acquaintances. They were more than old acquaintances. Su Mo gritted her teeth and thought to herself, Secretary, he couldn't have asked for more. Anyway, someone had to go. Besides, CEO Yi wouldn't go himself, which proved that Lu Man was nothing in his heart. So, Secretary He agreed. Thank you, Manager Su. I'm busy now. Su Mo smiled and stood up. Then I'll go now. I have nothing to do, anyway. Chapter 3983. She blinked. CEO Yi is really bothering me right now. Secretary He looked around and went over to ask softly, How is CEO Yi and Wen Yuan? One is in a cold war, while the other is pestering me. Sumo's voice was lazy. Divorce is unlikely. Even if Wen Yuan wanted to, President Yi wouldn't agree. Secretary He, you know that some men are just despicable. You spoil him, but he takes advantage of you. He thinks that others can't live without that diamond-studded thing of his. Secretary He's expression was indescribable. Su Mo then left for the parking lot. She sat in the car and browsed through Lu Man's information on her phone. Lu Man, female, born in 1989, she's allergic to lilies. Su Emo smiled, tossed her phone aside, and started the car. An hour later, Su Emo appeared in Lu Man's hospital room, dressed in a high-class suit. Lu Man was wearing a bathrobe and leaning against the headboard. Her long black hair spilled over her shoulders, giving her a frail beauty. She was talking to her assistant when Su Emo walked in, bringing with him a strange fragrance. Lu Man's expression changed when she saw the flowers in Su Mo's hands. "Take it out. Take it out," she sneezed as she spoke, her nose flowing out in a pathetic manner. Su Emo asked in surprise, "What's wrong, Miss Lu?" "CEO Yi asked me to see you. Are you not feeling well?" Lu Man's assistant immediately took the flowers out of her hands and threw them far away. She then came back for ventilation and said anxiously, "Lu Man is allergic to lilies." Are you really?" Su Emo sighed and said regretfully, "CEO Yi asked me to buy lilies. He said that lilies suit Miss Lu's temperament, and it would be a waste to throw them away." Sigh, CEO Yi's kind intentions. Lu Man looked at Su Emo and asked while enduring the itch in her nose, "Where's CEO Yi?" "The reporters are ready." "Reporters?" Su Emo sneered inwardly. Were they trying to create a couple? Su Emo broke into a smile. "CEO Yi is accompanying Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan misunderstood yesterday's matter, and CEO Yi is coaxing him. However, Miss Lu, let me give you a piece of advice. Your acting skills are really good. It's common in the entertainment industry to create a couple. However, if you do it with a married man, be careful. If it turns into a scandal, no one will be able to get out of it. CEO Yi might just kneel down and beg for forgiveness and continue his life. However, Miss Lu is different. After all, you have to maintain your image. Of course, Miss Lu Man is different. But what's the difference? Isn't she just a woman with 2 legs? There's nothing special about her. CEO Yi is not an inexperienced brat, and Miss Lu knows what he's doing. He's just giving Miss Lu face." Su Emo paused. CEO Yi and Miss Lu had a good time together, but CEO Yi isn't the only man Miss Lu has. Miss Lu isn't the only one that was preposterous back then. So, women, don't think that you are the most special one in a man's heart. If you have to pick one, it would be his daughter, wife, or his mother. Definitely not one of the women he has slept with. Lu Man's face turned ugly. No one had ever said something like that to her before. It was very rude. Of course, Su Emo was unhappy. Lu Man was like Kong Chiao, messy and messy. On the surface, she had to pretend to be pure and clean. A male whore and a female whore, they were quite a good match. Su Emo then said something important. "Since you're already in the hospital, why don't you take the chance to check for HIV?" She squeezed out a smile. "Rest well, Miss Lu."
She left.
Lu Man's assistant was young and didn't know what HIV was. Lu Man was furious. She gritted her teeth. "It's HIV." The assistant gulped and looked at Lu Man carefully. Lu Man was annoyed.
"Call CEO Yi for me.
Tell him that I'm not feeling well and can't act." The assistant dialed the number carefully. After a while, she said, "CEO Yi isn't picking up." Chapter 3984. Lu Man gritted her teeth. "Tell his secretary that I can't act in this film." The assistant responded with an, "Oh," and continued to make calls and communicate. Actually, she felt that Lu Man was a little too neurotic. It was normal for CEO Yi not to come. He already had a wife. She couldn't possibly get involved with him. Lu Man seemed to have changed into a different person. She wasn't like this in the past. Lu Man probably knew what she was thinking and said in a low voice, "I like him. I've liked him for many years." She had never thought that there would be a Wen Yuan. She had thought that she was the most suitable woman for him. She had never cared about Lin Shui or Lin Danny. She only cared about her position in his heart. They used to be bosom friends, but when he got married, she broke up with him. Lu Man was a proud woman. She didn't believe that she couldn't beat Wen Yuan. She didn't think that a married woman who had 2 children and was 3 years older than her would be a match for her. And for so many years, no man had ever ignored her, let alone for the sake of an old woman at home. Lu Man was so angry that she couldn't stand it anymore. She lifted the quilt and looked at the assistant. The assistant put away her phone and said in a low voice, "Secretary, he asked us to talk to Stars Entertainment's lawyer about the breach of contract." Lu Man was stunned. "Where's Yimubai? Contact him for me." The assistant didn't say anything. She kept staring at Lu Man. Lu Man knew what she meant and pursed her lips. "Get out of the hospital. What's the point of staying here?" The assistant followed. "You really don't want to create hype?" Lu Man changed her clothes and paused. "Do you believe that if I don't leave, Suemo will dare to spread the news that I'm doing an HIV test? He's crazy." She pursed her lips. "I heard that she and Wen Yuan are friends." "How boring." Lu Man was immediately discharged. The reporters waiting outside were still waiting for the headlines. Now they all left. Suemo returned to Stars Entertainment. Yimubai already knew that she had gone to the hospital and that Lu Man had been discharged. He called Suemo over. He sat on the sofa, and Suemo wanted to sit too. "You stand, Manager Su." Yimubai's voice was emotionless. "I have something to talk to you about." "I know what you're going to say." Suemo smiled and said, "I gave Lu Man a lily and asked her to check for HIV. By the way, CEO Yi, you used to have a relationship with her. Do you want to check it too? If you find out, don't hurt Wen Yuan." Yimubai narrowed his eyes and wanted to strangle Suemo. Suemo continued fearlessly, "Isn't that so? What's wrong? Is your heart aching?" Yimubai said coldly, "If it wasn't for Wen Yuan, you'd be kicked out of Starlight right now. If you want to scram, then scram. Whoever doesn't scram is a bastard." Sumo snorted lightly and threw his work pass in front of CEO Yi, giving him a slap in the face. After that, he sneered, "I have 200 million anyway. Even if I lose my job, my wife will support me." "Suemo, Wen Yuan is my wife." Yimubai said coldly, "Stop." Suemo turned his head. "Any other instructions, CEO Yi?" "Oh, I forgot to tell you that you are likely to become my ex-husband. At that time, Wen Yuan can get a large amount of alimony. Why should I work? Speaking of which, I still have to thank you, CEO Yi." Yimubai's face was livid. He stared at the hateful woman in front of him and asked her to come back. "Take this and get out." Sumo snorted while putting on the work pass. "CEO Yi, Wen Yuan doesn't know that you have such a bad temper, does he? Humph. A bitch is so hypocritical." Chapter 30, 985. Yimubai stared at Suemo and said coldly, "If you cause any more trouble, get the fuck off to Jupiter. Jupiter is about to be set on fire. I'll go to the underground city, even if I have to." Suemo said with a fake smile and left immediately. Yimubai sat quietly in the office for a while, feeling a headache coming on. He was thinking that Suemo was actually much more willful than Wen Yuan. Thinking of Wen Yuan, his headache grew. Although Wen Yuan stopped messing around with him for the time being, she was still cold. Yimubai missed her gentleness and coquettishness from a while ago. That was Wen Yuan's cutest side. He walked to the desk and picked up her photo. After a long time, he caressed it gently. "Secretary, his intercom came." He picked it up and was still looking at Wen Yuan's photo. "What's up?" "CEO Yi, Miss Lu Man is here and wants to see you." "She's at the front desk, Secretary," he said while holding his breath. Yimubai was stunned for a moment before replying indifferently, "Just say I'm not here. It's a private matter." Secretary, he knew that in CEO Ye's heart, Madam was still the most important, so she personally went downstairs to inform Lu Man and send her off politely. When Lu Man left, she knew that he was here, but he just didn't want to see her. Yimubai sat for a while longer. There wasn't anything too important, so he looked at the time and went straight to Wen Yuan's school. B University was a long-standing institution of higher learning that had produced many outstanding students. Wen Yuan, on the other hand, was very low-key. Yimubai didn't understand why she was so obsessed with teaching. Just as he said, she couldn't even buy a bag after teaching for a year. So why bother? His car drove into B University and drove all the way to the front of the school building. Somehow, the school's leaders were alerted. The vice principal personally invited Yi Mu Bai to his office to talk to his parents. No matter what, Yi Mu Bai would not let go of this opportunity to be invested in. Yi Mu Bai had seen this kind of situation many times, so he naturally handled it well. However, he still gave the vice principal some hope. In the end, he said casually, "It's my wife's first day at work, so I'm here to see her." The vice principal was dumbfounded, and so were a group of school leaders. It was normal to visit on the first day of school, but the wife had to visit on the first day of work. Were they afraid of being bullied? The vice principal wiped his sweat. "May I know which teacher Mrs. Yi is?" "Wen Yuan. I teach piano." Yi Mu Bai smiled faintly, his eyes filled with gentleness. The vice principal immediately understood. "Teacher Wen, so it's Teacher Wen." "Ah, that's right. Teacher Wen is very good. His family background and temperament are both first class." "No wonder." Then he chuckled softly. "Our academy's library is a little old. I've heard that when Laoshi often studied there when he was still in school. Now, I think I might be able to visit it as well." Yi Mu Bai took the checkbook and wrote a set of numbers. "Here's 20 million. If it's not enough, contact my secretary." The vice principal smiled. "CEO Yi, you're too generous. No matter what happens tonight, just stay in school for a meal and bring teacher Wen along. Wen Yuan used to be a good student of ours, just like the children of us old guys. We didn't even attend her wedding banquet, so CEO Yi, you can't refuse," the vice principal said while winking at the others. Of course, they were booing. In fact, Yi Mu Bai didn't want to refuse. He and Wen Yuan were in a stalemate now, and it could only be eased with external help. Chapter 3986. He agreed, but Wen Yuan didn't know. After Wen Yuan finished her class, she was ready to pick up Xiangnan and Yihui. At this time, the school's director came over with a complicated but happy expression. "Miss Wen, come out for a moment." It was Wen Yuan's first day of class, so she wasn't very familiar with the children. However, the children in their early 20s all liked this beautiful and gentle teacher. Wen Yuan packed her things and walked to the door briskly. She felt very good. Perhaps it was because she hadn't been to class for a long time. Perhaps this was what she wanted. In the school, she was completely an ordinary teacher. She didn't have the slightest bit of finickiness. She asked the director softly, "Mr. Zhai, is there any problem with my performance today?" The director smiled. "Wen Yuan, of course I know your ability. You used to be our star teacher. You see, the children all like you." Wen Yuan breathed a sigh of relief. "That's good. I'm afraid I'll be out of practice." Director Zhai changed the topic. "By the way, today is your first day at work. Do you have any thoughts?" "It's pretty good. I'm quite used to it." Wen Yuan was quite knowledgeable about the ways of the world. She reached out and shook hands with Director Zhai. "I have to thank you. I'll treat you to a meal later." Director Zhai was waiting for her to say this. She smiled mysteriously. "You don't have to wait for a few days. Tonight is the best time. Wen Yuan, I've already helped you call the school leaders. They're just waiting for you to have a meal." Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment. Then, she forced a smile. "Director Zhai, isn't this too high profile?" "High profile. The leaders value you very much. If you build a good relationship with them, it won't be a problem to get a title. Wen Yuan, you have to know that your qualifications are very good. Don't let the school leaders down." Director Zhai eagerly took care of her. "The meal has been booked. Is there any problem with your family?" As she said this, she looked at Wen Yuan with a burning gaze. Wen Yuan felt pressured. Under Director Zhai's gaze, she dialed Yi Mu Bai's phone. At this time, Yi Mu Bai was in the school's VIP room. He was drinking the best tea. When he saw Wen Yuan's call, he picked it up and smiled. "Wen Yuan?" Wen Yuan pursed his lips and said in a low voice, "I have a dinner, so I'll be home late. Get the chauffeur to pick up Xiangnan and Yihui, or you can pick them up after work." Yi Mu Bai's voice was a little low. "Wen Yuan, you said that your work doesn't affect taking care of the children. Today was an accident." Wen Yuan bit his lower lip. "It won't happen every day." He was silent for a while before he agreed. When Yuan hung up the phone and looked at Manager Zhai, "I've said it." Chief Zhai smiled and said, "When Yuan, are you really all right?"
No.
When Yuan smiled weakly, "I still have time for a meal." Director Zhai sighed. "It's said that marriage is the grave of love. When Yuan, I see that you're living quite well. It's not like you haven't changed at all." She was even more feminine. When Yuan smiled, "It's all right, Director." Zhai thought about the girl just now. She was more than all right. With that kind of beauty and that kind of figure, she could become 20 years younger if she slept with her every day. However, she could only be envious. She brought Wen Yuan to a guest house in the school. It was considered a star-rated guest house and was used to entertain VIPs. When Wen Yuan walked in to greet the school leaders, he was surprised to see Yi Mubai sitting in the seat of honor. She was stunned. Her gaze fell on his face, and she was speechless for a long time. "I'll update tomorrow." Chapter 3987. Yi Mubai sat at the head of the table and was surrounded by people. It was obvious that he was the target of flattery. Of course, when Yuan knew who this dinner party was for. She wasn't a fool. She thought, Yi Mubai must have donated money. When she was a little distracted, Dean Jai greeted, "This is CEO Yi from Stars Entertainment."
You know Wen Yuan, right?
When Yuan smiled faintly, "Dean Jai, stop pretending." Dean Jai was stunned. She probably didn't expect Wen Yuan to expose her. However, she was famous for her social skills in school. How could such a small scene be difficult for her? So she smiled. "Wen Yuan, you're being naughty." After saying that, he cheerfully arranged for Wen Yuan to sit beside Yi Mubai, and he himself took his seat. There were a lot of leaders in the school. 2 banquets were held. When the dishes were served, Wen Yuan's eyes widened. Her impression of a teacher was like Teacher Kong, who was uncorrupted. However, today, these delicacies in the eyes of ordinary people were served so quickly. It could be imagined how luxurious their lives were. When Yuan didn't say anything, she wouldn't lose her composure. After all, she came from a good family and had seen the world. However, Yi Mubai sensed her emotions. He took a cup with his slender fingers and poured a glass of water for her. "Teacher Wen, you must be thirsty after class. Have a glass of water to moisten your throat." When Yuan was still in a cold war with him. Hearing him call her Teacher Wen, she felt uncomfortable all over. She glanced at him, took the cup from his hand, and drank some water. Yi Mubai smiled faintly and then chatted with the department head next to him. He was straightforward and didn't seem to be too enthusiastic. However, who didn't want to flatter Yi Mubai? Being born in an aristocratic family, Yi Mubai was now a hot figure. No one could afford to offend him. Moreover, Yi Mubai controlled half of the entertainment industry. Most of the students trained by a school like B University had to be baptized in the entertainment industry. If they didn't flatter Yi Mubai, who else would they flatter? On the other hand, Yi Mubai was indifferent to everyone. He wasn't cold, but he didn't pay much attention to others either. He wasn't particularly warm to Wen Yuan either. He would flirt with her from time to time, which made Wen Yuan uncomfortable and unable to sit still. She wanted to go to the washroom, but just as she was about to move, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Wen Yuan, don't forget that you're the one treating today." Wen Yuan gnashed his teeth. "I just want to go to the bathroom." He smiled lazily and said nothing. Director Shai took the opportunity to talk to him about the new graduates and asked if Stars Entertainment was willing to absorb this batch of newcomers in the past 6 months. Yi Mubai's mind was on Wen Yuan. How could he be in the mood to listen to Director Shai's words? He listened indifferently and replied casually. Director Shai looked at him and knew what he was thinking. In CEO Ye's heart, he had high hopes for Wen Yuan. Perhaps there was something wrong with this couple. If they could make CEO Yi happy, not only would they donate money, they would also be able to contribute. Thus, Director Zhai winked at the school leaders, indicating where Wen Yuan was sitting. Then he said that they were going to drink white wine tonight. Yi Mubai didn't bat an eyelid and still smiled faintly. Director Zhai knew that he had bet on the right treasure. He asked the waiter to bring over 2 boxes of wine that had been stored for a long time. As he brought them to the table, he smiled and said, "This wine isn't famous. However, it was a tribute to the imperial palace in the Qing dynasty. Only the prince and the emperor could drink it. Today, we can only taste it because of CEO Yi." Chapter 3988. Although Director Zhai was a woman, she often socialized with others. Her alcohol tolerance was comparable to Sumo's, and she was much more tactful and cunning than Sumo. Before Wen Yuan came back, she directly poured a glass of white wine for Wen Yuan. And so did Yi Mubai. CEO Yi is straightforward. Director Zhai worked very hard. After pouring the wine, she asked the waiter to leave. She couldn't let the waiter see the school leaders fawning over outsiders. The leaders also wanted to save face. She closed the door and waited for Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan came over and was stunned when she saw the scene. She sat down and looked at the white wine in front of her, then looked at Yi Mubai. "Drink it for me. I'll drive later." He smiled lightly. "I'll ask the driver to come over." Wen Yuan was a little speechless. She lowered her voice. "Yi Mubai, why did you come to the school to cause trouble? I'm doing well in class. How am I going to get along with my colleagues in the future?" Yi Mubai was still indifferent. He smiled. "If you're not easy to get along with, then let's not get along. Anyway, I'm only teaching this class." He paused and then said, "Or, do you want to stay in school from morning to night?" Wen Yuan, he brushed her hair. "We agreed that you'll only go to class and not work." Wen Yuan was so angry that she didn't say anything. She didn't drink anyway. Yi Mubai didn't force her to drink, so he naturally gave her a hint to make her drink. The vice principal, and directors of different levels took turns to let Wen Yuan drink. After a few gulps, the wine was almost finished. Director Zhai poured another glass for Wen Yuan. Yi Mubai was talking to the vice principal. At this time, he looked over and said lightly, "Half a glass. Wen Yuan can't drink that much." Director Zhai's heart trembled. Wen Yuan was the most important person in CEO Ye's heart. She smiled, but her heart was trembling. She didn't dare to offend someone with a background like Yi Mubai, so she only dared to pour 30%. Wen Yuan couldn't drink anymore. She rarely drank white wine. Even red wine was poured out of the bottle, let alone white wine. Her face was hot, and she said softly, "Yi Mubai, I want to go to the bathroom." He retracted his gaze and looked at her face. His voice was gentle. "What's wrong?" Wen Yuan covered his chest. "I'm not feeling well. I feel a little hot. I want to get some air." Yi Mubai nodded. "Be careful." Wen Yuan nodded, held the edge of the table, and went out after saying goodbye to the others. When he went out, it was already dark. The campus was a little chilly and there weren't many people, but Wen Yuan felt comfortable. She didn't go to the bathroom. Instead, she wanted to take a walk on the old path. There was no light in that area, and it was a little dark. Wen Yuan remembered that there were many couples who would spend their nights there. She wondered if they would bump into each other now after walking for a while. Wen Yuan couldn't walk anymore. She always drank too much. He leaned against the kapok tree to rest for a while before he closed his eyes. A young man dressed in white walked out from behind the tree. He looked to be about 24 or 25 years old. He was young and good-looking, unlike the students here. Wen Yuan thought about it for a while before remembering that his name was Bai Jingxian. He was a newcomer in the entertainment industry who had been promoted by King Entertainment. He had become popular through puppets and had more than 20 million fans on Weibo. Bai Jingxian walked around and took a step back. He recognized that the person in front of him was Teacher Wen, who had been teaching during the day. Bai Jingxian moved forward. "Teacher Wen, did you drink? I remember that the school has rules that prohibit smoking and drinking." Chapter 3989. Wen Yuan was shocked. She opened her eyes and saw a tall and slender figure in front of her. She could vaguely see that it was Yi Mubai. She stared at him for a long time, and Bai Jingxian smiled. "Ms. Wen, do you want me to take you back?" Wen Yuan's eyes were still on his face. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "No, I can go back myself." She didn't ask why he was here because she didn't know him. But when Wen Yuan turned around, Bai Jingxian was standing behind her. He said firmly, "Wen Yuan, you taught me before. I came here today because I knew you were back in school." Wen Yuan felt a headache coming on. She didn't want Bai Jingxian to say that he admired her teacher. He was a public figure, and she was also considered half a public figure. Just as she was about to turn around, Yi Mubai walked over from the other side. He naturally heard Bai Jingxian's words. Wen Yuan's head hurt even more. Bai Jingxian ignored Yi Mubai and continued, "Ms. Wen, I've liked you since I was 5, and I still like you now." Wen Yuan looked at Yi Mubai and thought about Bai Jingxian behind her. She couldn't explain. Yi Mubai walked over quickly and put his arm around Wen Yuan's waist, letting her lean on his shoulder. Then he looked at Bai Jingxian. "Bai Jingxian, the university's motto is to respect teachers." Stinking brat, his hair hasn't even grown yet, and he already wants to steal his wife. Bai Jingxian smiled faintly. "CEO Yi, a man's maturity isn't just based on age and experience." He said slowly, "I like Wen Yuan." He didn't call her Ms. Wen but Wen Yuan. Yi Mubai said coldly, "She will always be your Ms. Wen." It doesn't matter. There are many couples who call each other teachers. For example, Uncle Feng calls her Ms. Zhao. Bai Jingxian didn't seem to care. Yi Mubai's good mood was gone. Where did this Bai guy come from? He must be an undercover agent from King Entertainment's Qin Mo. He couldn't be bothered and left with Wen Yuan. His mood wasn't as good as before, and he didn't want to deal with a bunch of people in school anymore. He always did as he pleased, and if he didn't want to go, then he didn't want to. Moreover, no one in school dared to make things difficult for Wen Yuan. After taking Wen Yuan into the car, he went back to get Wen Yuan's bag. When he returned to the car, Wen Yuan, who was sitting in the passenger seat, suddenly opened his eyes and stared at him. After a while, he said softly, "You're drunk driving." "I only drank a small cup," he said calmly. He closed the door and was about to start the car. "Wait," Wen Yuan said hurriedly. "Wait." He thought she had drunk too much and wanted to vomit, so he tilted his head and asked, "What's wrong? Are you not feeling well?" She grunted, then unbuckled her seat belt and, to his surprise, climbed into the back seat. When he sat down again and closed his eyes, Wen Yuan sighed softly. "It's safer behind." Yi Mubai's face was a little dark, and he immediately started the car. At this time of night, many signs lit up and changed. It was the brainwashing god name of Wandering Earth. There are thousands of paths. Safety first, driving in an irregular manner. 2 streams of tears for loved ones. Yi Mubai looked at the road signs. As he drove, he asked calmly, "Wen Yuan, if something happens to me, will you cry for me?" She closed her eyes. "After crying, I'll be the richest widow." His face was completely dark. He stepped on the accelerator. This time, it was Wen Yuan's turn to have a change of expression. Chapter 3990. He drove too fast, and Wen Yuan was drunk, so she was very uncomfortable. She grabbed the car door and said in a broken voice, "Yi Mubai, drive slower." His voice was a little cold. "Don't you want to be the richest widow?" Although he said so, he still slowed down the speed of the car to 50 kilometers per hour. There was a serious traffic jam. He thought about it and decided not to go home. So, he took Wen Yuan to the nearest 5-star hotel. She was not feeling well, and her face was a little pale as soon as she got out of the car. Although Yi Mubai was angry, he also felt sorry for her. He half-carried her to a presidential suite and helped her in. Fortunately, Wen Yuan was a good drinker, so she didn't vomit. She just took a nap on the bed. After waking up, she was still a little dizzy and didn't fully wake up. It was a little dark around. When she opened her eyes, she saw the magnified face above her. Wen Yuan closed her eyes again, turned her face to the other side and said faintly, "You scared me. Why didn't you turn on the light? And where is this?" "The hotel," he whispered in her ear. We won't go back tonight. When Yuan turned her face back and looked at him.
Why?
Yimubai moved his body slowly, grabbed her wrist, nailed her to the big bed, and smiled warmly. What do you think? When Yuan was so angry that she closed her eyes. Did you ask someone to make me drink just for this? Yimubai, are you shameless? He raised her hand high, restrained her with one hand, and pinched her delicate chin with the other. I'm shameless? When Yuan, is it shameless to have sex with your wife? She glared at him angrily, which was a little cute. He suddenly let go of her, went to the bar, and picked up a bottle of red wine. As he poured 2 glasses of red wine, he said casually, Since you said I'm shameless, I have to sit down. Then he turned sideways to look at her. When Yuan was stunned, she subconsciously got out of bed and wanted to escape, but her feet were weak after only 2 steps. Yimubai puts his arm around her waist and presses her against the bar counter. His thin lips stick to her ear. Are you afraid of Mrs. Yi? Wen Yuan struggled weakly. That's enough, Yimubai. You're too evil. I'm your wife, not your exclusive prostitute. He looked at her and said very softly, Wen Yuan, you said something that made me unhappy again, didn't you? His fingers gently caressed her red lips. I have always treated you as my wife. There are so many women outside, and I have never thought of fighting with others. I want to do it with my own wife. Is that wrong? As he spoke, he moved closer and bit the tip of her nose lightly. It was a very punishing action. Then he nibbled her face, her chin, and the soft flesh of her neck. He was in no hurry to do anything to her, but teased her as punishment and fed her wine. When Yuan was half drunk, and her whole body was soft on his palm, he wantonly treated her, and she was as soft as a kitten, at his mercy. Yimubai looked down and stared at her in a white suit, which was particularly dignified, and her hair was tied up, which gave her a kind of beauty of abstinence. It was the kind of beauty that was extremely beautiful in the living room, but it made people want to strip her in the bedroom. Yimubai did the same. As when Yuan screamed, he treated her like this. Her black curly hair also fell down, as if she had changed into a sexy thing. Chapter 30, 991. As a man, Yimubai actually preferred this side of Wen Yuan. He held her waist and fed her another glass of red wine. When she leaned weakly on his shoulder, he asked, Did you know Bai Jingxian before? Wen Yuan looked at him with a particularly silly smile on her face. She closed her eyes and sighed softly. He's my student. He's the most handsome student I've ever taught. Yimubai's fingers moved to her neck and held it dangerously. Wen Yuan. She laughed softly, very foolishly. Then, she hugged his neck and tilted her head like a little girl. Yimubai, are you jealous? His face was cold, and he wanted to push her away. What do you think? She was still smiling and murmured at the corner of his mouth. I used to call him Xiao Bai. Whenever I called him Xiao Bai, his face would turn red. It was because his surname was Bai, which was the same character as the person she liked. That was why she remembered him. When Yuan thought about it vaguely, recalling that bitter love. However, Yimubai thought that she was thinking about that pretty boy, so he bit her neck hard as a punishment. When Yuan hugged his neck and said in a low voice, Are you angry? He didn't say anything. He pressed her against the bar counter and kissed her. He didn't use too much force, which made her want to cry. Yimubai's voice whispered in her ear, When Yuan, you're not allowed to see him in the future. When Yuan was drunk, but at this moment, she was a little sober. She smiled. What if I see him? I'm not allowed to go out to work, and you're going to lock me up again? He carried her with one arm, carried her to the bed, and threw her down. She bounced around and finally fell on the soft big bed. Her black hair was spread on the white bedsheet, which looked very extravagant and tempting. Moreover, she was wearing the clothes that he had picked out for her, which made her look very sexy. He slowly leaned over and whispered in her ear, When Yuan, when a man buys clothes for a woman, it's meant to be torn. He was terrifyingly violent. After Bai Jingxian appeared, CEO Yi, who was nearly 40 years old, was in great danger. In terms of appearance, family background, and ability, he was better than Bai Jingxian, but Bai was only 24 years old. He was as old as a puppy. He was 10 years younger than Wen Yuan, but he followed Wen Yuan like a puppy and adored her. If he hadn't come here on a whim today, would there have been a good-looking little puppy following Wen Yuan all the time? When Wen Yuan was in class, he would come over and call her teacher Wen, looking for opportunities to get close to her. The more Yi Mubai thought about it, the more upset he became, and the more he tormented Wen Yuan. Seeing that she couldn't take it anymore, he whispered into her ear, "Have you ever thought about doing it with that little wolf dog? Can a man who hasn't even fully grown his fur satisfy you? Can he know what position you like?" Wen Yuan flicked her black hair and bit her lip.
Stop talking.
Why not? Are you feeling guilty? He held her hand and was terrifyingly domineering. His handsome face was filled with malice as he forced her. Wen Yuan had long been squeezed dry by him. She bit her lip, and her nose was red from crying. He bit the tip of her nose angrily. "Is it because you're in contact with him? Is that why you have to go to school so that you can go on a date with him, huh?" CEO Yi, who was in danger of being middle-aged, was extremely unconfident in facing a 24-years-old puppy. He still pressed her down and reached for her phone. "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."